I spent 8 agonizing years looking for my missing wife until the night the power went out in my own guest house. I went down to the basement to flip a breaker and froze when I heard a faint tapping sound from behind a wall that was not supposed to be there. What I found hiding in the dark made my heart stop. My wife had not run away to Europe like my daughter-in-law claimed. She had been held captive in a windowless room right beneath my feet for 8 years. I stood there in absolute shock before I realized I was living in a house of monsters. My name is Warren. I am 72 years old and a retired structural engineer living in Atlanta. Before I continue this story about how I brought my own family empire crashing down on the people who betrayed me, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the truth always finds a way out of the dark. Growing up in Georgia taught me that if you want something built to last, you have to pour the foundation yourself. That is exactly what my wife Yvonne and I did. We spent 40 years building a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio from the ground up. We bought lots when nobody wanted them. We held on to them when the gentrification wave hit Atlanta and turned our properties into gold mines. The crown jewel of our hard work was a sprawling brick estate in one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in the city. We designed every single inch of it. But tonight, I was not sitting in the grand living room of the home I built. I was confined to the cramped 400-square-foot guest house out by the back fence. The main house was blazing with lights, music, and the clinking glasses of a high-society charity gala hosted by my white daughter-in-law, Chloe. She and my son Kendrick had taken over everything after Yvonne supposedly vanished, and I suffered a massive heart attack from the stress. They claimed I was too fragile and too confused to manage the estate. So they moved me out here to the yard, treating me like a stray dog they occasionally remembered to feed. Chloe loved playing the gracious, wealthy hostess, using the generational wealth my wife and I bled for to impress her snobby friends and her powerful father. The heavy bass from the gala band was vibrating against my thin windows. I was sitting in my worn armchair reading an old architectural digest, trying to ignore the bitter taste of betrayal that had become my daily reality. The winter air outside was freezing, and I had the space heater running on full blast. Suddenly, with a loud pop, my reading lamp died. The heater shut down. The refrigerator hummed to a halt. The entire guest house plunged into pitch blackness. I sat there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the sudden dark. I looked out the window. The main house was still glowing like a lighthouse across the manicured lawn. The power outage was completely isolated to my small unit. I pulled out my phone and squinted at the bright screen. My hands were shaking slightly from the cold creeping into the room, but I managed to type a message to Chloe. I kept it brief. I typed, "The power's out in the guest house. I need to come inside to the basement and flip the breaker." I hit send and waited in the freezing dark. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I could see the silhouettes of guests laughing and drinking champagne through the massive bay windows of the main house. Finally, my phone buzzed. Her reply was short and dripping with the kind of casual cruelty she usually reserved for the hired help. It read, "We have 100 important guests here, Warren. I am not having you wander through the party in your pajamas and embarrass us. The breaker box is locked anyway. Just go to sleep. Sit in the dark. We will deal with it tomorrow." I read those 3 words over and over. Sit in the dark. It was not just an instruction for the night. It was the philosophy of how she and my own son had treated me for nearly a decade. Sit in the dark while we drain your bank accounts. Sit in the dark while we host lavish parties with your money. Sit in the dark while you mourn the wife we say abandoned you to live some fantasy life overseas. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. It was the ghost of the heart attack that had nearly killed me 8 years ago when I woke up to find Yvonne gone and a typed note on the kitchen counter saying she was leaving me. But tonight, the tightness in my chest did not turn into pain. It turned into a cold and highly focused anger. Chloe thought she had all the keys. She thought she controlled all the access points because she changed the locks on the front doors. But she forgot who drew the blueprints for this property. I am a structural engineer. I spent my life understanding how things are put together, which means I also know exactly how to bypass them. When I built the main house, I insisted on an external maintenance hatch hidden behind the thick azalea bushes on the north side of the property. It was designed for emergency plumbing access and led directly into the subterranean levels of the house. I put on my thick winter coat and my heavy work boots. I grabbed my heavy-duty metal flashlight from the kitchen drawer and slipped out into the biting Atlanta night air. The music from the gala masked the sound of my footsteps crushing the dead winter leaves. I crept along the perimeter of the brick mansion, staying deep in the shadows to avoid Chloe's private security guards who were busy smoking near the front gates. The cold wind bit at my face, but my blood was boiling. I reached the azalea bushes, pushing through their dense branches. Yvonne had planted these bushes herself 30 years ago. Thinking of her gave me the strength to keep moving. The heavy iron grate of the maintenance hatch was rusted but not locked. I gripped the cold metal with my 72-year-old hands. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the sharp ache in my joints, and hauled it open. A rush of damp, stale air hit my face. I squeezed through the narrow opening and descended the steep concrete steps into the basement. It was completely silent down here, a stark contrast to the thumping bass vibrating through the floorboards directly above my head. I clicked on my flashlight. The bright beam cut through the pitch blackness, sweeping across old cardboard boxes, discarded furniture, and dust sheets. I made my way toward the utility room where the main electrical panels were housed. I knew this basement like the back of my hand. I knew exactly how many paces it took from the bottom of the stairs to the boiler. But as I rounded the corner past the old wine racks, my flashlight beam hit something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A wall. A solid floor-to-ceiling cinder block wall blocking the far end of the basement. I lowered the flashlight, blinking in total confusion. My mind immediately went to my original blueprints. This wall was absolutely not supposed to be here. It had not been here 8 years ago before my heart attack. The mortar work was relatively recent. It was sloppy in places, done quickly and cheaply. It looked like the work of an amateur trying to hide something fast. Why would Kendrick and Chloe build a sealed-off room in the deepest, darkest corner of the basement without any doors? I stepped closer to the rough gray blocks. I reached out and ran my fingers over the cold, dry mortar. As I stood there trying to make sense of this architectural anomaly, I heard it. A sound so incredibly faint I thought it was just the water pipes settling in the cold. Tap, tap, tap. I held my breath. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pressed my ear against the freezing cinder block. Tap, tap, tap. It was deliberate. It was rhythmic. It was human. My blood turned to absolute ice. I stepped back and aimed my flashlight up and down the length of the mysterious wall. Near the very top, almost hidden by the dark shadows of the wooden floor joists, was a heavy steel ventilation grate. It was small, no bigger than a shoebox, and secured with thick industrial bolts. I did not think. I just reacted with a primal urgency I did not know I still possessed. I rushed over to the dusty workbench I had abandoned years ago and dug frantically through the rusty tools until my hands closed around a heavy iron crowbar. I dragged a heavy wooden crate over to the cinder block wall. I climbed up onto it, ignoring the screaming pain in my knees, and wedged the flat edge of the crowbar behind the thick steel grate. I threw all of my body weight into it. My shoulders burned. My lungs gasped for air. The metal shrieked loudly against the concrete. With a violent and echoing crack, the old bolts gave way, and the heavy steel grate crashed down to the basement floor, kicking up a massive cloud of gray dust. I quickly shined my flashlight through the narrow, dark opening. The bright beam illuminated a sterile, windowless room. There was a thin, stained mattress on the cold floor. I saw a cheap camping toilet and a small stack of bottled water. But my eyes did not register any of that for more than a second. My eyes were completely fixed on the figure huddled in the far corner, shielding her face from the sudden blinding glare of my flashlight. She was incredibly frail. Her hair was completely white and matted. Her clothes hung loosely off her dangerously thin frame, and she was shaking uncontrollably in the damp cold. She slowly lowered her hands from her face, squinting painfully into the light. The breath violently left my lungs. The heavy metal flashlight nearly slipped from my trembling fingers. I was staring into the terrified, sunken eyes of a woman I had wept for, a woman I had mourned for nearly a decade, a woman I had spent 8 agonizing years believing had abandoned me when I needed her most. It was Yvonne. My beautiful wife was alive. I stared through the open vent at the frail woman huddled on the dirty mattress. My brain refused to process the image. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to tear down that cinder block wall with my bare hands and roar until the foundation of the house collapsed. But I did not scream. Growing up as a black man in the Deep South taught me early on that a loud reaction usually gets you killed. Survival requires silence. I swallowed the massive lump of shock and rage forming in my throat. I gripped the cold edges of the steel vent so hard my knuckles burned. I lowered my face to the opening and whispered her name, Yvonne. The woman on the mattress flinched. She pulled her thin knees closer to her chest like a frightened animal trying to hide from a predator. I called out to her again, keeping my voice steady and low. I told her it was me. I told her Warren was here. Slowly she lifted her head. Her sunken eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light reflecting off the basement walls. When her gaze finally locked onto mine, I saw the exact moment the empty terror in her eyes shattered into pure disbelief. She dragged herself across the cold concrete floor toward the wall. Her hands were trembling violently as she reached up toward the vent. Her fingers were so thin they looked like fragile twigs. I reached my hand through the opening and gently grasped her fingers. Her skin was freezing. She began to sob. It was a silent, hollow sound that tore right through my chest. She kept repeating my name over and over like a prayer she had been saying in the dark for 8 years. I asked her what happened. I begged her to tell me how she ended up trapped in the belly of the house we built together. For 8 years, I had carried the agonizing weight of her sudden disappearance. The official story that my son Kendrick and his wife Chloe sold to the police and to me was that Yvonne had packed a bag in the middle of the night and boarded a flight to Europe. They said she was tired of our life. They showed me a typed letter she supposedly left on the kitchen counter. Reading that letter broke my heart so completely that I suffered a massive heart attack the very next morning. As I held her freezing fingers through the vent, Yvonne revealed the terrifying truth. She never wrote that letter. She never packed a bag. The night before she supposedly left, Chloe had offered her a cup of chamomile tea. Yvonne drank it and woke up 2 days later chained to a pipe in this very room. While I was lying in a hospital bed fighting for my life under the oxygen tent, Chloe and Kendrick were busy executing their master plan. The heart attack was the perfect distraction and the perfect excuse. They used my critical medical condition to go to a corrupt judge who happened to be a close friend of Chloe's father. They had me declared legally incompetent. They seized full medical and financial power of attorney over the entire estate. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as the pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped into place. But one question still burned in my mind. If they wanted us out of the way, why did they keep her alive in this concrete tomb? Why not just kill her and be done with it? I asked her this question, my voice trembling with a mixture of horror and desperate curiosity. Yvonne let out a bitter, exhausted sigh. She leaned her head against the rough cinder blocks and told me the one thing Chloe and Kendrick could not bypass: the biometric trust fund. When Yvonne and I started making real money in the Atlanta real estate market, we knew the system was rigged against people who looked like us. We had seen too many black families lose their generational wealth to predatory banks, shady lawyers, and fine print loopholes. So we locked our $15 million fortune in an ironclad trust. The only way to authorize massive withdrawals or liquidate the core assets was through a dual biometric verification system. It required my signature and Yvonne's thumbprint along with her voice recognition. Because they declared me mentally unfit, my signature was easily bypassed by Kendrick acting as my legal proxy. But the bank still required Yvonne's physical biometric data to release the dividends every 6 months. Chloe needed Yvonne alive to siphon the wealth. Twice a year, Chloe would come down to this dark dungeon with a portable digital scanner. She would withhold food and water for days until Yvonne was weak enough to comply. Then Chloe would force Yvonne to press her thumb to the glass and read a specific authorization phrase into a microphone. It was a perfectly evil system. They kept her alive just enough to act as a human key to the vault. They were bleeding our legacy dry 1 6-month interval at a time to fund their lavish lifestyle, their luxury cars, and the high society charity galas they hosted directly above her head. The sheer calculation of it all made me nauseous. I had spent 8 years sitting in the tiny guest house blaming myself for not being a better husband. I had spent 8 years watching my daughter-in-law parade around in designer dresses bought with the blood money she extracted from my captive wife. I squeezed Yvonne's hand and promised her I was going to get her out. I told her I was going to call Detective Russo, the only honest cop who had actually bothered to look into her case before Chloe's father shut the investigation down. I told Yvonne to stay strong for just a little while longer. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door at the top of the basement stairs groaned open. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent subterranean space. We both froze. Heavy footsteps began to descend the wooden stairs. I knew the rhythmic thud of those boots anywhere. It was Kendrick, my own flesh and blood, the boy I had taught to throw a baseball, the boy I had sent to the best private schools in Georgia. I quickly pulled my hand out of the vent. Yvonne scrambled backward on the floor, retreating into the dark corner of her cell. I panicked. There was no time to run back to the maintenance hatch. I scrambled behind a massive pile of discarded furniture and old canvas drop cloths just a few feet away from the cinder block wall. I crouched down, holding my breath, my heart hammering so violently against my ribs I thought it might trigger another heart attack. Part of me still desperately wanted to believe Kendrick was a victim in all of this. For 8 years, I had watched Chloe berate him, control him, and treat him like a lapdog. I wanted to believe that Chloe had built this wall in secret. I prayed to God that Kendrick was coming down here to investigate the power outage and that he was about to discover his missing mother and break down in tears. I wanted my son to be the hero. I watched from the shadows as Kendrick approached the cinder block wall. He did not look surprised. He did not look confused. He walked directly up to a small metal slot near the bottom of the wall that I had not noticed earlier. It looked like a dog door. Kendrick pulled a small ring of keys from his pocket and unlocked the metal flap. He was holding a cheap plastic tray covered with leftover scraps from the charity gala upstairs, half-eaten pieces of bread, discarded vegetables, and cold cuts. He shoved the plastic tray roughly through the metal slot. It hit the concrete floor inside with a loud clatter. I watched my son lean down and speak into the slot. His voice was not filled with remorse or fear. It was filled with profound annoyance. He told her to eat the garbage and keep her mouth shut. He told her they had important investors upstairs, and if he heard even a single scratch coming from the basement, he would turn off the small heating pad she used to keep from freezing to death. He said they needed her healthy for the bank scan next month, but he had no problem making her suffer until then. Hearing my son speak those words broke something deep inside my soul. It was a clean, unfixable fracture. The boy I raised was dead. The man standing in front of me was a monster wearing my last name. He was not manipulated by his wealthy white wife. He was an active, eager participant in the torture of the woman who gave him life. He was perfectly willing to keep his own mother in a lightless box just to maintain his country club membership and his fancy suits. Kendrick locked the metal flap. He turned around and walked back up the stairs without a single backward glance. He shut the heavy basement door and locked it from the outside. The darkness and silence returned to the basement. But I was no longer the same man who had climbed down that maintenance hatch 15 minutes ago. I was no longer a grieving husband or a confused old man living in the guest house. The sorrow was completely gone. The hesitation was completely gone. I stood up from behind the pile of furniture. I looked at the cinder block wall one last time. I realized that my family was truly dead. All that was left was the enemy, and I knew exactly how to destroy them. I stood alone in the dark basement, listening to the faint sound of Yvonne crying over the tray of discarded food. Every tear she shed felt like a burning coal dropping into my stomach. I thought about the sheer arrogance of my son and his wife. They believed that because I was old, I was obsolete. They believed that because I stayed quiet in the guest house, I was defeated. But they failed to understand the mind of an engineer. An engineer does not react to a collapsing structure by throwing a tantrum. An engineer analyzes the weak points, calculates the load-bearing walls, and systematically removes the supports until the entire building comes crashing down on its own footprint. I knew I could not just run upstairs and start swinging my fists. Chloe had private security guards patrolling the front lawn. Her father had half the local police precinct in his pocket. If I made a scene, they would simply restrain me, claim my dementia had reached a violent stage, and lock me away in a psychiatric ward before the sun came up. They would move Yvonne to a secondary location, and I would never see her again. I had to be smarter than them. I had to be colder than them. I quietly walked back toward the rusty maintenance hatch. I squeezed my body through the narrow opening and pulled myself back out into the freezing Atlanta night. The biting cold wind hit my face, but I did not feel it. My entire body was vibrating with a dangerous new energy. I carefully pushed the iron grate back into place, making sure it looked completely undisturbed. I crawled through the thick azalea bushes, tearing my coat on the sharp branches but refusing to make a single sound. I stood up and looked at the main house. The charity gala was still raging. I could see the silhouettes of the wealthy elite drinking champagne and laughing, completely unaware that they were dancing on top of a dungeon. I could see Chloe moving through the crowd in her expensive red dress, playing the role of the perfect philanthropic hostess. I could see Kendrick standing near the bar laughing at a joke, completely unfazed by the fact that he had just fed his mother garbage like a stray animal. They thought they had won. They thought the game was over 8 years ago. But the game was just beginning. I walked back toward the dark guest house, my mind racing through architectural blueprints, network security protocols, and the legal loopholes of the estate I had built. I needed evidence. I needed ironclad, undeniable proof that could survive the scrutiny of Chloe's powerful father and his corrupt judges. I needed to expose them not just to the police, but to the entire world. I reached the door of my small guest house and stepped inside the dark freezing room. I did not care about the broken breaker anymore. I embraced the dark. The dark was my domain now. I opened the bottom drawer of my old desk and pulled out a small black burner phone I had hidden months ago for emergencies. It was time to stop being the victim and start being the architect of their absolute ruin. I closed the door of my freezing guest house and stood in the absolute dark. The physical rage inside me was a living, breathing thing. My hands were shaking so violently that I dropped my flashlight on the wooden floor. I wanted to march right back out there, find a heavy iron crowbar and smash the front windows of the main house. I wanted to walk into that extravagant charity gala, grab my son by the collar, and drag him down the basement stairs so all those wealthy guests could see exactly what he had done to his own mother. But I forced myself to breathe. I am a structural engineer. I know that explosive demolition is dangerous and unpredictable. If you want to bring down a massive fortress, you do not just swing a hammer blindly. You target the load-bearing pillars. I sat down at my small desk and stared at my black burner phone. The most obvious reaction would be to dial 911 immediately and demand that the police storm the property. But that was the exact trap Chloe had built for me. Calling the authorities without undeniable proof was a guaranteed dark suicide mission. Chloe did not just marry into my family for the money, she brought her own kind of dark power. Her father was Judge Thomas Sterling, a man who controlled the local justice system like it was his own private chessboard. He had police captains attending his summer barbecues and city council members in his deep pockets. If I called emergency services right now, a patrol car would arrive in 10 minutes. The officers would walk into a beautifully decorated charity event. Chloe would greet them with her perfect smile and offer them a cup of very warm premium coffee. She would put her arm around my shoulders, look at the officers with fake tears in her eyes, and tell them that her poor 72-year-old father-in-law was having another severe dementia episode. She would claim I was hallucinating, that my late wife was still alive. Because they legally stripped me of my competency 8 years ago, the officers would not even bother searching the basement. They would apologize to Chloe for the interruption. Worse than that, Chloe would immediately know I had found the hidden room. The moment the police left the huge property, she and Kendrick would move Yvonne to a secondary location somewhere I could never find her again. Then Judge Sterling would sign a fast-tracked medical order committing me to a locked psychiatric facility for the rest of my life. I would die in a padded room, and Yvonne would die in the dark. I needed hard, undisputable evidence. I needed a paper trail so toxic and so undeniable that even a corrupt judge could not make it disappear. I needed the biometric data. I stood up and took a deep breath. The charity gala was reaching its very loud peak. Through the thin walls of my guest house, I could hear the loud cheers and the heavy bass of the live jazz band echoing across the lawn. The noise was the perfect cover. Chloe always handled her financial crimes from the massive mahogany desk in the master office on the second floor of the main house. I knew this because I was the one who built that office. I designed the hidden service staircase that ran from the old catering kitchen straight up to the second floor hallway. It was meant for staff to move silently through the massive house. Tonight, it was my path to absolute vengeance. I slipped back out into the freezing wind. I avoided the front gates completely. I moved through the dense shadows of the tall oak trees I had planted decades ago. 2 private security guards were laughing and smoking near the main driveway, completely distracted by the expensive cars parked along the street. I moved past them like a ghost. I reached the side entrance of the catering kitchen. The door was locked with a modern digital keypad, but I knew the master override code because I watched Kendrick punch it in earlier. He typed it 3 months ago when he thought I was asleep on the porch. 6824. The green light blinked. The heavy door clicked open. I stepped inside the warm house. The smell of expensive roasted meats and fine wine made my stomach churn. I could hear the catering staff shouting orders in the main kitchen just down the hall. I quickly opened the narrow wooden door that concealed the service stairs and slipped inside the dark shaft. The music from the ballroom below was deafening. I climbed the steep wooden steps as fast as my knees would allow. My heart was pounding against my ribs, but my mind was completely clear. I reached the second floor and cracked the door open. The long hallway was empty. All the guests were downstairs drinking my money. I moved silently across the thick Persian carpet and turned the brass handle of the master office. The door opened, and I slipped inside, locking it firmly behind me. The room was dark except for the faint moonlight spilling through the large bay windows. I walked over to the massive mahogany desk. There, sitting right in the center, was her sleek laptop. This machine was the command center of her entire fraudulent empire. This was where she communicated with her father, where she managed the offshore accounts, and where she processed the stolen biometric data. I opened the laptop. The screen glowed to life, casting a harsh white light across my face. A password prompt appeared on the screen. Chloe was arrogant. She believed nobody in the house was smart enough to challenge her, especially not the old man living in the guest house. She used the same password for everything. I knew it because I had spent the last 2 years quietly observing them, studying their habits, watching their fingers type on their phones when they thought I was not paying attention. She used her wedding anniversary, combined with the name of her childhood dog. I placed my trembling hands on the keyboard and typed it in. The screen unlocked. I was in. I quickly pulled a small high-capacity flash drive from my coat pocket and plugged it into the side port of the machine. I did not have time to browse through her thousands of personal files. I needed the smoking gun. I opened the main hidden digital directory. I started searching for anything related to the trust fund. My eyes scanned the screen rapidly. Financial spreadsheets, legal drafts, emails from her father. Then I saw it. A heavily encrypted folder hidden deep inside a subdirectory labeled Estate Planning. The folder was titled simply Why Biometrics. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. This was the digital vault where she stored the voice recordings and the thumbprint scans she forced Yvonne to make every 6 months. This folder was the undeniable proof of kidnapping, extortion, and wire fraud. I clicked on the heavily locked digital folder. I dragged it over to my flash drive icon. A small progress bar popped up on the screen. It estimated the download would take exactly 3 minutes. The files were massive high-resolution audio and biometric data points. I stared at the green bar slowly creeping across the screen. 1 minute passed. The music downstairs shifted to a slower tempo. I nervously checked my watch. The gala was supposed to last until midnight. I still had plenty of time. The progress bar hit 50%. I kept my eyes glued to the screen, silently urging the machine to move faster. 60%, 70%. I could almost feel the heavy chains falling off Yvonne. This small silver piece of plastic was going to destroy their entire world. I was going to hand this drive over to the federal authorities and watch the Federal Bureau tear this house apart piece by piece. 80%. Just a few more seconds. Then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of high heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor in the hallway outside. The footsteps were moving fast, and they were heading straight for the office. My blood ran completely cold. I looked very closely. 90%. The brass handle of the office door suddenly jiggled. The person outside realized the door was locked. I heard a frustrated sigh. It was Chloe. She had left the party and come upstairs. I heard the sharp jingling of her keys as she searched for the office key. 95%. Come on. Move. The key slid smoothly into the brass lock. The heavy deadbolt clicked open with a loud echoing snap. 98%. I yanked the drive out as Chloe walked into the office to powder her nose, ready to apply a fresh coat of lipstick. The heavy brass door handle clicked open with a sharp metallic snap. I had less than 2 seconds to react. I yanked the silver flash drive from the side of the glowing laptop and shoved it deep into my coat pocket. My knees screamed in sudden agony as I threw my body across the thick Persian carpet. I slid behind the massive velvet drapes that covered the large bay windows just as the heavy wooden door swung inward. The velvet fabric was heavy and smelled of expensive cleaning. I held my breath and pressed my back against cold glass. The bright overhead lights flickered on, blinding me for a fraction of a second through the small gap in the thick curtains. I heard the sharp, rhythmic clicking of expensive high heels echoing against the polished hardwood floor. It was indeed Chloe. She walked into the room carrying the scent of expensive champagne and heavy perfume. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh of pure exhaustion. She was completely unaware that the man she had locked out in the cold was standing less than 5 feet away from her, holding the digital key to her absolute destruction in his pocket. Through a tiny sliver in the dark velvet drapes, I watched her pace back and forth across the luxurious office. She was wearing a stunning emerald green gown that probably cost more than an average car. She walked over to the massive mahogany desk and tossed a small silver clutch purse onto the polished wood. She did not even look at the laptop screen, which had thankfully faded to black just moments before she entered. She rubbed her temples with her manicured fingers, looking incredibly annoyed. Then she quickly reached for her gold-plated smartphone and dialed a familiar number. I stood perfectly still in the dark corner. I slowed my breathing until it was nothing more than a shallow, silent rhythm. I knew exactly who she was calling. It was her father, Judge Thomas Sterling. The phone rang twice before a deep, commanding voice answered on speakerphone. Chloe let out another heavy sigh and began to complain bitterly. She told her father that the charity gala was going perfectly, but she was completely exhausted from putting on a fake smile for all the wealthy donors. She said she needed a break from all the pretending and all the noise. Then her tone shifted from tired to downright vicious. She started talking about me. She told her father that the old man was becoming a massive problem. She complained that keeping me alive in the guest house was draining their resources and their patience. She said I had texted her earlier complaining about a power outage. She laughed a cold, cruel laugh and told her father she just told me to sit in the dark. Hearing her say those words out loud to the man who helped steal my life filled my mouth with the bitter taste of pure hatred. Her father chuckled on the other end of the line. His voice was thick with extreme arrogance. He told Chloe to be patient and to stick to the plan. He reminded her that they needed me alive just a little while longer to avoid any suspicion from the estate lawyers. Chloe whined that I was useless and pathetic. She said she was tired of looking at my face every time she looked out the back window. She suggested they increase my medication to keep me sedated and quiet permanently. My blood turned to absolute ice as I listened to them. I knew I had to get out of that room. If she decided to open the curtains to look down at the dark guest house, she would find me hiding there. I would be completely trapped. I needed to move while she was entirely distracted by her hateful conversation. Chloe turned her back to the window and began pacing toward the large bookshelves on the opposite side of the office. She was talking loudly about a new offshore account she wanted her father to open. This was my only chance. I slowly pushed the heavy velvet fabric aside right away. I stepped out from behind the thick drapes. My heavy work boots sank quietly into the thick Persian rug. Every single muscle in my 72-year-old body was wound tight with adrenaline. I kept my eyes completely locked on the back of her emerald green dress. She was still ranting to her father about the biometric scans. She told him that the next scan for Yvonne was scheduled for next week. She complained about how awful it smelled in the basement and how much she hated going down there. I took another silent step toward the open door. I was halfway across the big room. The heavy wooden door was standing wide open just a few feet away. I could hear the loud jazz music from the ballroom drifting up the long hallway. The music was masking the faint sound of my breathing. I took another cautious step. I was almost entirely out of the office, but then my foot clipped the edge of the massive mahogany desk. It was a tiny miscalculation born from pure exhaustion. My heavy winter coat brushed against a sleek, custom fountain pen resting near the edge of the polished wooden flat surface. The heavy gold pen rolled off the edge of the desk. Time seemed to slow down completely. I watched the pen fall through the air in absolute horror. It hit the hardwood floor just past the edge of the rug with a sharp, bright clatter. The sound was incredibly loud in the quiet office. Chloe stopped talking instantly. The voice of her father asking what happened echoed from the smartphone speaker. I did not freeze. I threw myself silently out the open door and pressed my back against the cold wall of the dark hallway outside right then and there. Inside the office, Chloe spun around. I heard her high heels click sharply against the floor as she walked over to the desk. I held my breath entirely. I heard her pick up the heavy gold pen from the hardwood floor. There was a long, terrifying silence. Then I heard her voice shift from annoyed to highly suspicious. She told her father that someone had been in her office. She said the pen was on the floor, but she had left it perfectly straight next to her notepad. She quickly noticed the laptop screen was slightly warm to the touch. Panic quickly crept into her voice. She told her father she would call him right back. She hung up the phone. I knew I had seconds before she walked out into the hallway and saw me. I moved down the corridor as fast as my old legs could carry me. I reached the hidden service stairs and pulled the narrow door shut just as Chloe stepped out of her office. I heard her yelling down the main staircase for Kendrick. She sounded completely frantic. I descended the steep wooden steps in the pitch dark, grasping the wooden handrail very tightly. I reached the bottom of the stairs and slipped back out through the catering kitchen side door. The freezing winter air hit my sweating face. I needed to get back to my guest house and lock the door. But as I stepped into the shadows of the garden, I saw the sweeping beams of heavy-duty flashlights cutting through the dark. Chloe had already radioed her private security team. I heard the static of a walkie-talkie very close by. A gruff voice announced that the perimeter was locked down and they were searching the back gardens immediately right now. I was now completely trapped. The security guards were moving fast, spreading out across the manicured lawns. I dropped down behind a thick row of tall hedge bushes. The frozen ground soaked through my pants. The flashlight swept over the bushes just inches above my head. If they caught me out here in the cold, they would drag me inside and search my pockets. They would find the silver flash drive and destroy the only proof of Yvonne being alive. I reached into my coat pocket with a trembling hand and pulled out my small black burner phone right away. I could not call a random dispatcher. I needed the one man in the entire city who knew my family was corrupt. I dialed the direct cell number of Detective Russo. The line rang once. A tired voice answered. I whispered quickly into the phone. I told him my name. I told him I had the absolute proof he asked for 8 years ago. I told him my wife was alive and trapped in the basement. Russo did not ask any stupid questions. His voice went completely cold and professional. He told me he was exactly 10 minutes away now. I ended the call with Detective Russo and shoved the burner phone deep into the pocket of my heavy winter coat. 10 minutes. That was exactly how long I had before the police cruisers would tear up the long driveway and surround the estate. But 10 minutes was an absolute lifetime for someone like my daughter-in-law, Chloe. If her private security guards found me hiding in the frozen bushes, they would alert her immediately. She would use those 10 minutes to completely wipe her laptop clean. She would drag Yvonne out of the basement through the back service tunnels and load her into the trunk of a car. By the time Russo walked through the front doors, Chloe would be standing in the grand foyer holding a glass of champagne, playing the innocent victim of a confused old man. I could not let that happen. I needed to freeze the board. I needed to trap the rats exactly where they were. I looked up at the massive brick estate glowing against the dark winter sky. When Yvonne and I designed this house 20 years ago, we built it to be an absolute fortress. We installed a state-of-the-art lockdown system to protect our family from home invasions. It was designed to seal the entire perimeter with reinforced steel shutters at the push of a single button. But to trigger that system, I needed to get inside the primary security control room located deep in the east wing. I crept through the freezing garden using the thick shadows of the tall oak trees as my cover. The private security guards were still frantically searching the opposite side of the lawn, their flashlights cutting uselessly through the thick winter fog. I reached the side entrance near the garage and used the same master override code on the digital keypad. 6824. The heavy door clicked open. I stepped into the warm, dimly lit service hallway and moved silently toward the east wing. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands were completely steady. The long corridor smelled of floor wax and old wood. I reached the solid steel door of the security control room. Through the small reinforced glass window, I saw a single guard sitting in a large leather chair. He was a large, muscular man wearing a black tactical uniform. He was staring intensely at a massive bank of glowing security monitors, sipping hot coffee from a paper cup. His heavy two-way radio sat right next to his right hand. If he saw me and grabbed that radio, the entire property would instantly swarm with armed men. I looked around the narrow hallway and spotted a red metal emergency toolbox sitting on a utility cart near the wall. I opened it silently and wrapped my fingers around a heavy solid steel pipe wrench. The cold metal felt heavy and familiar in my grip. I took a deep breath. I am an old man, but I spent 40 years working on active construction sites, lifting steel beams and wrestling with heavy machinery. I still knew exactly how to swing a heavy tool. I opened the control room door. The hinges did not make a single sound. I stepped inside the small glowing room. The guard heard my heavy boots squeak on the linoleum floor and started to turn his head in his chair. He never even got the chance to open his mouth. I swung the heavy steel wrench in a tight, perfectly calculated arc. I did not want to kill him. I just needed him to sleep. The heavy iron struck the side of his neck right on the nerve cluster with a sickening heavy thud. The massive guard instantly went entirely limp. His eyes rolled back into his head and he slumped forward onto the main control desk, knocking over his coffee cup. Hot, dark liquid spilled across the glowing keyboards. I quickly grabbed the heavy man by the straps of his tactical vest and dragged his unconscious body off the control console, lowering him gently to the floor. My shoulders burned from the extreme physical effort, but I ignored the pain. I did not have time to tie him up or secure him. I turned my absolute attention to the massive wall of security monitors. The screens displayed every single angle of the sprawling estate. I could see the security guards still searching the dark bushes outside, completely unaware that the house had been breached. I could see the massive ballroom packed with 150 wealthy elite guests, drinking and laughing. I could see Chloe standing near an extravagant ice sculpture, looking nervously at her gold smartphone. I wiped the spilled coffee off the main control keyboard with my sleeve and quickly typed in the master override sequence. The system prompted me for the absolute lockdown command. A flashing red warning box appeared on the central monitor asking for confirmation. I did not hesitate for a single second. I hit the red enter key. Instantly, a loud mechanical siren began to wail throughout the entire estate. It was a deafening, piercing sound designed to disorient intruders and alert the local authorities. On the security monitors, I watched as heavy, reinforced steel shutters began to violently drop down over every single window and exterior door of the massive mansion. The heavy steel hit the marble floors with explosive, synchronized crashes. The magnetic locks on the thick interior doors engaged with loud, sharp clicks. The entire house was instantly transformed into a sealed, impenetrable vault. Nobody was getting in. And more importantly, nobody was getting out. I stared at the main ballroom camera feed. The scene inside the luxurious room had shifted from elegant celebration to absolute, total chaos. The loud jazz band stopped playing mid-note. The wealthy guests were dropping their expensive champagne glasses and screaming in genuine terror as the heavy steel shutters slammed down over the massive bay windows, completely blocking out the night sky. The main double doors leading to the grand foyer were magnetically sealed shut. The elite members of Atlanta high society were pushing and shoving each other like trapped animals, desperately trying to pry open the immovable doors. Women in expensive gowns were tripping over each other. Men in tailored tuxedos were slamming their fists against the reinforced glass. I zoomed the camera in on my daughter-in-law. Chloe was standing in the center of the panic, looking completely bewildered. She was shouting at the confused catering staff, demanding to know who authorized the lockdown sequence. She grabbed my son Kendrick by the arm and pointed furiously toward the upper balcony. She assumed this was a technical glitch, a stupid malfunction of the smart home system she never bothered to understand. I watched Kendrick pull out his cell phone, attempting to call the security guards outside, but the thick steel shutters blocked all cellular signals. They were completely isolated in a luxurious cage built with the very money they had stolen from my wife. But trapping them in the room was only the first phase of my plan. I needed to destroy their reputation in front of the very people they were trying to impress. I needed to expose the absolute rot hiding beneath their expensive clothes and fake smiles. I turned away from the security console and moved to the audio-visual server rack located on the opposite side of the small control room. This tall server bank controlled the massive high-definition projector hanging from the ceiling of the grand ballroom. Chloe had been using it all night to display glowing statistics about her fake philanthropic charities to secure more donations. I pulled the small silver flash drive from my coat pocket and plugged it into the main terminal. The encrypted files I stole from her laptop quickly loaded onto the screen. Earlier, when I was downloading the biometric data in her office, I noticed a hidden folder containing live internet protocol addresses. Chloe was not just recording Yvonne for the bank trust fund. She had installed a hidden live feed camera inside the basement cell so she could monitor her prisoner from her cell phone whenever she wanted. I found the specific web address for the hidden basement camera and typed it into the main broadcasting software. A small black window popped up on my computer screen. It took a few agonizing seconds to buffer. Then the stark, bright night vision image of the freezing basement cell appeared. I could clearly see Yvonne sitting on the dirty, thin mattress, shivering violently in the dark. She was holding her knees to her chest, looking completely broken. The plate of garbage food Kendrick had thrown at her was sitting on the concrete floor. My heart broke all over again seeing her like that, but the sadness quickly hardened back into absolute rage. I highlighted the live video feed. I routed the high-definition video signal directly to the massive projector hanging in the center of the trapped ballroom. Then I linked the sensitive audio feed directly to the massive surround sound speakers that had just been playing cheerful jazz music minutes ago. I rested my hand hovering directly over the final broadcasting button. On the security monitor, I could see the 150 guests in the ballroom still screaming and demanding answers from a completely panicked Chloe. They wanted to know why they were locked in. They were demanding that she fix the problem immediately so they could go home to their comfortable lives. Chloe was yelling at Kendrick, telling him he was useless and ordering him to break a window. But those windows were bulletproof glass covered by solid steel. They were trapped in a vault of their own making. I took a deep, steady breath, looking at the live feed of my beautiful captive wife. I promised her I would bring the house down. Then I pressed the execute button. The heavy steel shutters remained firmly locked over the massive bay windows of the grand ballroom. Panic was a living thing in the room, spreading quickly among the wealthy elite guests who were completely unaccustomed to being trapped. Chloe realized she was losing control of her high society audience. She smoothed down her expensive emerald green dress and confidently walked up the carpeted steps to the center stage. She grabbed the heavy silver microphone from its stand and forced a bright, reassuring smile onto her face. The room was buzzing with anxious whispers, but her sharp voice cut through immediately. She told the audience that the lockdown was simply a minor technical malfunction of the new smart home security system. She laughed a fake tinkling laugh and assured everyone that her private security team was already handling the situation outside. She asked the catering staff to pour more premium champagne and encouraged the jazz band to resume playing, but the musicians were too nervous to pick up their brass instruments. Seeing that the crowd was still highly agitated, Chloe decided to play her absolute best card. She transitioned seamlessly into her highly rehearsed charity presentation about strong family values today. Chloe spoke passionately about the importance of protecting the vulnerable members of our society. She talked about her deep commitment to elderly care and the absolute necessity of treating our senior citizens with dignity and profound respect. Every single word falling from her mouth was a calculated lie designed to extract more donations from the rich investors standing in the room. She even forced a fake tear to well up in her right eye. She told the crowd how much she missed her dear mother-in-law who had tragically abandoned their family 8 long and painful years ago today. She pointed a manicured finger toward my son Kendrick, who was standing near the bar, looking incredibly nervous. She praised him for being a devoted son who worked tirelessly to keep his aging father comfortable during his severe mental decline. She painted herself as a beautiful, selfless martyr carrying the heavy emotional burden of a broken family. The wealthy guests began to relax their posture. The powerful spell of her manipulative charisma was working perfectly. Wealthy older women in the front row nodded in profound sympathy, wiping away their own genuine tears as they listened to her absolute twisted fiction. I watched all of this unfold on the glowing security monitors inside the locked control room. The sheer audacity of her lies made my stomach turn completely sour. She was standing on a stage built with my money-wearing jewelry, bought with my credit cards claiming to be a saint, while my wife was starving in the dark right beneath her expensive high heels. I placed my finger firmly on the execute button of the main broadcasting console. It was time to pull back the heavy velvet curtain and show these wealthy fools the real monster they were blindly funding. I pressed the key. Down in the ballroom, the massive high-definition projector hanging from the ceiling suddenly clicked loudly. The screen behind Chloe brightly flashed from a beautifully designed charity logo to a stark, blinding static. Chloe stopped speaking mid-sentence. She turned around with a look of extreme annoyance, assuming the audio-visual staff had made a clumsy mistake. The wealthy audience murmured in confusion as the static cleared and a stark night vision image completely filled the massive screen. It took a few long, agonizing seconds for the elite crowd to understand what they were actually seeing. The live feed showed a terrifying, dark cinderblock room that looked exactly like a subterranean prison cell. In the center of the frame sat an incredibly frail, elderly black woman on a thin, dirty mattress. It was my beautiful Yvonne. She was shivering violently in the damp cold, pulling her thin, torn blanket tightly around her fragile shoulders. The crowd grew incredibly quiet. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom was heavier than the steel shutters covering the windows. The wealthy donors stared up at the massive projection screen, trying to comprehend the horrifying reality of the dark image presented. Then the specific details of the video feed began to register with the horrified audience. Through the high-quality hidden camera I had routed to the screen, everyone could clearly see what Yvonne was holding in her trembling hands. Earlier, when Kendrick threw the tray of discarded food into her cell, he had carelessly lined the plastic tray with a page from the daily local newspaper. Yvonne was gripping that newspaper page close to her chest for warmth. The bright camera lens captured the large printed headline and the exact date, clearly proving this was a live, current broadcast feed. The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. A woman standing near the front row let out a loud, piercing gasp and dropped her expensive crystal champagne glass. The glass shattered against the marble floor, echoing loudly in the completely silent room. Other guests began to point frantically at the screen, recognizing the unmistakable facial features of the woman Chloe had just claimed was living happily in Europe. It was Yvonne, the original matriarch of the estate. The horrific truth was undeniable, and it was broadcasting live in extremely high definition right in front of their very horrified eyes. Chloe froze completely. Her perfect fake smile melted right off her face, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Her trembling fingers lost their tight grip on the heavy silver microphone. It slipped from her hand and hit the wooden stage floor with a deafening screech of audio feedback that made several guests cover their ears in pain. She stared at the giant screen, her mouth opening and closing silently like a fish pulled out of the water. Her perfectly constructed world of elegant lies and high society privilege was instantly disintegrating right in front of her very eyes. The wealthy investors who had just been writing massive checks to her fake charity were now backing away from the stage in absolute horror. They were looking at Chloe not as a generous philanthropic leader, but as a ruthless, vicious kidnapper. The whispers in the room quickly escalated into loud, angry shouts. People demanded to know what was happening and where this horrific footage was coming from. Chloe tried to speak, but her throat was completely dry. She looked desperately out into the panicked crowd, searching for her husband to save her from this complete public relations nightmare unfolding quickly. Kendrick was already moving. True to his cowardly nature, his first instinct was not to protect his wife or to confess his horrible sins. His only thought was to cut the live video feed and hide the undeniable evidence. I watched him on my security monitors as he pushed roughly through the crowd of angry, confused guests. He sprinted frantically toward the large double doors of the audio-visual control booth located at the back of the grand ballroom. His face was pale and drenched in a thick layer of cold sweat as he reached the strong wooden doors tightly. He grabbed the brass handles and pulled with all of his physical strength, but the doors did not budge an inch. When I initiated the master lockdown sequence, I made absolutely sure to engage the magnetic heavy-duty locks on every single access point, including the media booth. Kendrick slammed his heavy shoulder against the solid wood, screaming in absolute frustration. He kicked the door repeatedly, leaving scuff marks on the expensive polished surface. The wealthy guests watched the son of the house acting like a trapped, desperate criminal, further confirming their worst suspicions about the entire completely corrupted family. Chloe finally found her voice. She began screaming hysterically at the crowd, claiming the video was a fake computer-generated hoax designed by a jealous rival. She begged her wealthy friends to stop looking at the screen and demanded that someone break down the heavy steel shutters so they could all escape this horrible prank. But absolutely nobody was listening to her anymore. The undeniable reality of Yvonne shivering in the dark basement holding the daily newspaper was far too powerful. The elite donors pulled out their expensive cell phones, instinctively trying to dial for the local police immediately today. They quickly realized they had zero cellular signal inside the locked steel vault. The panic in the ballroom reached a dangerous boiling point. It was the exact moment I had been waiting for. I leaned forward in the security control room and pressed the microphone button that connected directly to the master public address system. The heavy speakers mounted in the four corners of the grand ballroom crackled to life. I made sure my voice was completely calm and steady. "Good evening, Atlanta," I said very loudly and clearly over the massive microphone. "Meet the real sponsor of tonight's gala." I watched the glowing security monitors in the dark control room. The heavy iron front gates of the estate were fully locked down under my strict command. Through the high-definition exterior cameras, I saw the flashing red and blue lights of several police cruisers tearing up the long driveway. They were moving incredibly fast, cutting through the thick winter fog. Detective Russo had not come alone tonight. Knowing the extreme power of Judge Sterling, he had brought a fully armed tactical response team. The heavily armored vehicle parked aggressively on the pristine, manicured lawn, crushing the expensive winter flowers. Men dressed in heavy black tactical gear poured out of the massive vehicles holding rifles and thick steel battering rams. They looked completely confused by the massive steel shutters sealing the luxurious mansion. Russo stepped out of his unmarked car wearing a heavy brown coat. He looked up at the impenetrable fortress I had created. He pulled out his radio, trying to understand how to breach a house designed by a paranoid structural engineer. I leaned over the main security console and typed in a specific override sequence. I did not want them to destroy the thick exterior walls completely. I wanted them to walk right into the waiting trap. With a loud mechanical groan, I raised the massive steel security shutters, covering the front entrance of the main foyer. I remotely unlocked the heavy oak front doors. The armed officers immediately flooded into the grand entryway, their heavy boots echoing loudly against the imported Italian marble floors. But I made absolutely sure to keep the reinforced magnetic locks engaged on the massive double doors leading into the grand ballroom. The police were inside the house, but the wealthy rats were still completely trapped inside their luxurious dark cage tonight. Inside the locked ballroom, the absolute panic had reached a terrifying fever pitch. The elite guests were completely hysterical. Some wealthy men were violently throwing expensive wooden chairs against the thick steel shutters covering the windows, but the reinforced metal did not even dent. The heavy chairs simply shattered into pieces across the polished dance floor. Chloe was standing desperately on the center stage, bathed in the cold, stark light of the massive projector screen. The live night vision video of my beautiful Yvonne shivering in the dark basement was still broadcasting directly behind her for everyone to see clearly. Chloe realized her entire carefully constructed empire of lies was crumbling into absolute dust. She grabbed a spare microphone from the wooden podium and began screaming frantically at the terrified crowd. She completely abandoned her sweet philanthropic persona right then. Her voice was shrill and completely unhinged. She told the wealthy donors to stop looking at the giant screen immediately. She shouted that the horrific video was a highly sophisticated artificial intelligence deepfake. She claimed that her demented father-in-law, meaning me, had hired professional computer hackers to create a fake video to ruin her immaculate high reputation completely. She aggressively pointed her finger at the hidden camera lenses scattered around the room, shouting that I was a dangerous, insane old man having a severe psychotic break. She desperately promised her rich investors that her father, the powerful Judge Sterling, would personally sue every single person who believed this ridiculous technological hoax. A few of her closest wealthy friends actually seemed to hesitate. The extreme confidence in her vicious lies was a terrifying weapon she had mastered over 8 long years. They wanted to believe her because the alternative meant they had been proudly funding a horrific violent crime today. I sat in the dark security control room, watching her desperately spin her web of poisonous lies. She actually thought her expensive education and her smooth words could erase the stark reality of the live video feed. I felt a cold smile spread across my face. I reached out and touched the glowing silver flash drive still plugged into the main audio-visual broadcasting console. I had downloaded much more than just a single live internet protocol address from her locked computer. I had the entire encrypted archive of biometric verification sessions stolen from her office earlier this very evening. I clicked on a specific digital folder labeled Voice Authorizations and selected the most recent audio file recorded just 3 months ago. I routed the crystal clear audio directly into the massive surround sound speakers hanging in the 4 corners of the grand ballroom. I turned the volume dial all the way up to its maximum capacity. Chloe was still screaming about artificial intelligence when her own cold, vicious voice suddenly boomed throughout the massive room, completely drowning her out. The recording was incredibly clear. The wealthy guests froze entirely as they listened to the undeniable, absolute, shocking, horrific truth. The recording captured Chloe explicitly telling Yvonne that if she did not press her thumb to the glowing digital scanner and read the banking authorization phrase, she would turn off the basement heating pad for an entire week. The guests heard the horrific sound of Yvonne weeping softly, begging for just a small cup of clean water. They heard Chloe laugh, a cruel, dismissing laugh. The recorded voice of Chloe loudly reminded Yvonne that her life was only worth $15 million and not a single penny more. The recording completely destroyed the artificial intelligence defense in 1 single second. It was impossible to fake the exact cruel intonation of Chloe threatening a starving old woman for absolute financial gain. The reaction inside the grand ballroom was absolutely immediate and entirely catastrophic for my daughter-in-law. The wealthy, elite investors who had spent the entire evening writing massive checks for her fake charitable foundation suddenly realized the horrifying truth. They were not supporting the elderly or funding medical research. They were directly financing a brutal kidnapping and extreme elder abuse. A prominent local bank executive who had just praised Chloe minutes ago turned completely pale, dropping his expensive drink. He dropped his expensive leather checkbook onto the floor as if it was on fire. The elite women who had previously admired her elegant emerald green dress now looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust and utter revulsion. They realized they were locked inside a heavily armored room with a ruthless sociopath who had locked her own mother-in-law in a lightless dungeon for 8 agonizing years. The crowd completely turned against her. The desperate shouts of confusion transformed into loud, aggressive demands for swift justice. Several large men moved aggressively toward the center stage, backing her up completely. They backed Chloe into a corner. She dropped her microphone and desperately looked around for her husband. But Kendrick was cowering behind the expensive catering tables, completely paralyzed by his own pathetic cowardice. He was pressing his hands over his ears, trying to block out the horrific sound of his own wife torturing his mother over the massive speaker system. The absolute betrayal was complete and total. I watched the glorious destruction of their social empire from my glowing monitors, feeling a profound sense of cold justice washing over my tired, 72-year-old aching bones right now today. Just outside the heavy double doors of the grand ballroom, Detective Russo and his heavily armed tactical team had finally arrived. Through the hallway security cameras, I saw them planting a massive hydraulic breaching tool against the thick wooden frame of the locked doors. I knew the magnetic locks were incredibly strong, but the combined force of the heavy police equipment would eventually tear the thick wood completely off its iron hinges. I leaned forward and watched the specific camera angle pointing directly at the main entrance of the grand ballroom, waiting for the final, glorious, climactic, explosive breaching moment. With a massive, deafening crack that echoed over the chaotic screams of the wealthy guests, the heavy wooden doors violently burst open. Thick splinters of expensive wood flew across the polished marble floor. The heavy magnetic locks finally gave way under the immense pressure. Detective Russo stormed into the grand ballroom holding his heavy service weapon, followed closely by 10 heavily armed tactical officers dressed in black body armor. They immediately commanded everyone in the room to freeze and get down on the floor. The incredibly wealthy guests immediately complied, dropping to the expensive rugs in absolute, sheer, overwhelming terror. The tactical officers quickly formed a tight perimeter, sweeping their bright flashlights across the chaotic scene. Russo kept his weapon aimed directly at the center stage where Chloe was standing, completely trapped under the glaring light of the massive projector showing her horrific crimes. She looked at the armed police officers and then looked down at her pathetic husband cowering near the catering tables. The ultimate survival instinct of a selfish parasite completely took over her mind immediately. Chloe aggressively pointed her shaking finger directly at Kendrick. She screamed that he did it and locked his own mother up completely. The heavy reinforced doors of the security control room hissed as I released the magnetic locks from the inside. I stepped out of the dark sanctuary and into the brightly lit hallway of the second floor. The loud, chaotic sounds of shouting police officers and terrified wealthy guests echoed up the massive grand staircase. I walked slowly toward the marble balcony, looking down at the absolute destruction of the fake empire my son and his wife had built. The tactical officers in heavy black body armor were moving with extreme precision through the massive grand ballroom below me right now. They were systematically forcing the incredibly wealthy investors to stay down on the floor. Detective Russo was standing near the center stage, his heavy service weapon drawn and pointed directly at the 2 people who had stolen my life. I placed my heavy work boots on the top step of the grand marble staircase. Every single eye in the chaotic room slowly turned to look at me as I began my slow, deliberate descent. I was no longer the frail, confused old man they had forced into the freezing guest house. I was the powerful architect of their total ruin. The wealthy elite guests stared at me in absolute stunned silence as I walked down the sweeping marble steps. The women in their expensive torn emerald and diamond gowns shrank back in profound fear as I passed them. The powerful men in their custom-tailored suits averted their eyes, unable to look at the man they had unknowingly helped to torture. I did not care about their guilt or their pathetic apologies. My eyes were locked entirely on the cowering figure of my son Kendrick. He was kneeling on the expensive rug near the shattered wooden doors, entirely defeated today. His expensive tuxedo jacket was covered in dirt and spilled premium champagne. He looked absolutely pathetic and incredibly small. He was trembling violently as the tactical police officers surrounded him with their weapons drawn. I reached the bottom of the grand staircase and walked slowly across the polished dance floor. The sea of terrified, wealthy donors parted for me like a retreating tide. Detective Russo saw me approaching and gave a small, respectful nod, lowering his heavy weapon just a fraction. He knew exactly what this specific moment meant to me after 8 long years of forced, agonizing, total silence. I stopped walking exactly 3 feet away from my trembling son. The loud, piercing sirens from the police cruisers outside were still wailing loudly through the cold winter night. But inside the ballroom, everything felt incredibly still and quiet. Kendrick slowly raised his head to look at me. His face was completely covered in thick sweat and terrified tears. He did not look like the confident, arrogant businessman who had shoved a tray of discarded garbage through a metal slot just an hour ago. He looked like a frightened, cornered animal entirely out of options and deeply, extremely, truly afraid. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. He just let out a pathetic whimpering sound that made my stomach turn with absolute, profound disgust. This was the boy I had raised with everything I had. This was the boy I had taught to be strong and honorable. Now he was just a broken coward kneeling in the ruins of his own horrific greed. He reached out with his trembling hands and grabbed the bottom edge of my heavy winter coat, pulling on the fabric like a completely desperate, crying, terrified, pathetic, small, frightened child. Kendrick fell forward, pressing his sweating forehead against the toes of my heavy work boots. He began sobbing uncontrollably, his voice echoing loudly in the completely silent room. He begged me to forgive him over and over again. He desperately claimed that he never wanted to hurt his mother and that he was entirely forced into this horrific situation. He pointed his shaking finger toward the center stage where his wife Chloe was currently being detained by 2 heavily armed tactical officers. He screamed that Chloe was a complete, evil, twisted monster who absolutely, completely ruined his innocent, perfect life. He aggressively blamed her for the cinder block wall, the hidden camera, and the forged biometric trust fund documents. He cried that Chloe had threatened to take his children away and completely ruin his life if he did not comply with her evil demands. He looked up at me with his pathetic, tear-filled eyes, claiming that he was a victim of her powerful, wealthy family and their corrupt influence. He swore to me that he loved Yvonne and that he was secretly planning to rescue her from the dark basement someday, very soon, when the timing was absolutely perfectly right. Listening to his pathetic, desperate lies filled me with a level of cold rage I had never experienced before in my entire 72 years of life. He was completely willing to throw the mother of his children to the wolves just to save his own miserable skin. He refused to take any absolute responsibility for his own horrific actions. He completely forgot that I had watched him through the hidden camera willingly throw garbage at his starving mother and threatened to turn off her only source of precious warmth inside that horrible, terrifying, freezing, dark, concrete, brutal, silent cell. He forgot that he was the one who signed the legal documents declaring me mentally incompetent so he could steal my $15 million estate. He was not a helpless victim manipulated by a cruel wife. He was an active, eager participant who loved the money and the high society status far more than he loved his own flesh and blood. I looked down at him feeling absolutely no pity, no sadness, and no paternal instinct whatsoever. The boy I had loved died a very long time ago. The man kneeling before me was a dangerous, evil, terrible, selfish monster. I firmly grabbed his trembling hands and violently ripped them away from my heavy winter coat. I took one deliberate step back, creating a clear space between us. Kendrick looked up at me with a confused, desperate expression, still crying thick tears of fake remorse. I pulled my right arm back and struck him across the face with everything I had left in my tired old body. The loud, sharp slap echoed across the massive grand ballroom like a loud, sudden gunshot. The incredible physical force of the heavy blow threw him backward onto the completely solid, cold marble floor. His lip instantly split open, spilling bright red blood down his weak, trembling chin. The wealthy elite guests gasped loudly in profound shock, but not a single police officer moved to stop me. Detective Russo simply looked away, pretending he had not seen a single thing. Kendrick lay on the floor, holding his bleeding face in absolute stunned silence. I looked down at him and spoke my words dripping with absolute pure venom. I told him he was completely dead to me. I told him he would never see my face or his beautiful children ever again today, tomorrow, forever. I turned my back completely on my sobbing son and walked directly toward Detective Russo. The seasoned police veteran looked at me with a mixture of profound respect and deep sorrow. He had warned me about Judge Sterling 8 years ago, but even he could not have imagined the absolute horrific depths of this family betrayal. I reached deep into the front pocket of my heavy winter coat and pulled out the heavy brass master keys to the lower subterranean levels of the absolutely massive, totally sprawling, incredibly large, dark brick family home standing around us right here tonight today. The metal felt incredibly cold against my sweating palm. I held the heavy keys out to the detective. My voice was completely steady, but my heart was breaking all over again knowing what he was about to find down there in the absolute dark. I told Russo that my wife Yvonne was locked in a hidden cinderblock room at the very back of the basement behind the old wine cellar. I told him she was incredibly frail and needed immediate emergency medical attention right now. Russo firmly took the heavy brass keys from my trembling right open-aged steady hand. He began shouting urgent orders directing his medical team toward the basement. Meanwhile, Chloe was fighting the tactical officers trying to break their strong grip. She was kicking her expensive high heels and violently thrashing her body. Her beautiful dress was torn and her perfect blonde hair was ruined. She screamed incredibly furious racist insults, turning her venomous attention directly toward me. She tried to use her white privilege, shouting loudly at the officers. She screamed, "Do you know who my father is? Arrest this aggressive black man immediately." The officers completely ignored her empty threats, securely handcuffing her tight wrists. I led Detective Russo and his heavily armed tactical team away from the chaotic grand ballroom and down the long hallway toward the catering kitchen. The panicked voices of the wealthy elite guests faded behind us as we descended the narrow hidden service stairs into the freezing subterranean levels of the massive estate. The air down here was thick and smelled of damp earth and dark secrets. I pointed the beam of my flashlight toward the back of the basement, illuminating the cinderblock wall that my son and his cruel wife had built to hide their absolutely horrific, unforgivable crimes. Russo did not wait a single second. He aggressively signaled 2 large tactical officers carrying heavy steel sledgehammers. They stepped forward and swung their massive tools directly into the center of the rough gray mortar. The deafening sound of shattering concrete echoed violently through the dark basement. Dust poured into the freezing air like thick gray smoke. The officers swung again and again, completely destroying the physical barrier that had separated me from my beautiful wife for 8 long, agonizing years. The heavy concrete blocks finally collapsed inward, creating a massive, jagged hole in the fake wall before us today. Detective Russo stepped through the gray dust cloud, sweeping his bright tactical flashlight across the small, windowless room. I followed right behind him, my heart hammering violently against my tired ribs. The bright white light illuminated the thin, stained mattress on the freezing floor. Yvonne was sitting there, trembling violently, shielding her sensitive eyes from the sudden blinding glare. The armed officers immediately lowered their heavy weapons, realizing there was no threat in this dark cell, just an incredibly frail, broken woman. I pushed past the men in black body armor and dropped heavily to my knees right there now. I did not cry. There was no time for tears right now. I reached out and wrapped my arms around her frail, shaking body. We held each other in a fierce, desperate embrace. Her incredibly thin arms wrapped around my neck, holding on to me as if I was the only solid thing left in the entire world. I could feel every single bone in her back through the thin, ragged clothes she was wearing. She buried her face into my heavy winter coat, breathing in the scent of the freezing outside air she had been denied for a long decade. We did not speak a single word to each other in that powerful moment. The absolute profound silence between us spoke of survival and pure, unbreakable resilience. I held my beautiful wife tightly, silently, promising her that the people who did this to her would spend the rest of their miserable lives rotting in a cage much worse than this dark concrete box. Paramedics wearing bright reflective jackets rushed through the jagged hole in the wall, carrying heavy medical equipment and a bright yellow stretcher. I gently pulled back from the embrace, allowing the emergency medical technicians to carefully work. They moved with incredible speed and professional urgency. A female paramedic checked her pulse and listened to her breathing while another quickly wrapped a thick thermal emergency blanket around her freezing shoulders. The lead paramedic looked at me with a completely grim expression. He told me that Yvonne was suffering from severe malnourishment, extreme dehydration, and dangerous hypothermia. He said her vital signs were incredibly weak, and she needed immediate emergency hospitalization right away. They carefully lifted her frail body onto the portable stretcher, strapping her in securely to prevent any further injury to her fragile, weak, tired, broken bones. I walked right beside the stretcher, holding her freezing hand as the paramedics navigated the steep wooden basement stairs. We emerged from the dark catering kitchen into the bright, warm, luxurious main hallway of the estate. The stark contrast was absolutely sickening. The walls were covered in expensive art, and the floors were made of imported Italian marble, paid for entirely by the horrific suffering of the woman currently lying on the emergency stretcher. As we moved toward the main entrance, the wealthy guests were being escorted out of the grand ballroom by the tactical police officers right there now. They stopped and stared in absolute silent horror as the paramedics pushed Yvonne past them. The elite members of Atlanta high society finally saw the true horrific physical cost of the charity gala they had been enjoying all night. We reached the massive front doors and stepped out into the freezing winter night. The entire front lawn was completely covered in flashing red and blue police lights. The large emergency ambulance was waiting in the circular driveway with its engine running loudly and its rear doors wide open. I felt a small, profound sense of deep, absolute, pure, true relief. But before the paramedics could even load the heavy stretcher into the back of the ambulance, 3 sleek, black luxury cars suddenly sped through the open iron front gates. The expensive vehicles slammed on their brakes, skidding violently across the frozen, manicured lawn. The doors flew open and 5 men dressed in incredibly expensive tailored suits stepped out into the chaotic crime scene. They moved with the supreme, terrifying confidence of men who completely owned the local justice system. They were the high-powered defense lawyers employed by Chloe's incredibly wealthy father, the powerful, corrupt Judge Thomas Sterling, right now. The lead attorney was a tall, aggressive man with slicked-back hair and a completely arrogant expression on his sharp face. He marched directly past the armed police officers, completely ignoring the yellow crime scene tape. He walked straight up to Detective Russo and demanded that the police release Chloe immediately. The arrogant lawyer aggressively claimed that the entire lockdown and the video broadcast were part of a massive illegal extortion scheme orchestrated by a severely mentally unstable old man. He pointed his manicured finger directly at me standing near the open doors, staring right directly back at him today. The lead defense attorney quickly reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He shoved the paperwork directly into the chest of Detective Russo. The lawyer loudly declared that he had an active, legally binding court order signed by a local judge proving that I was entirely, completely, legally incompetent. He shouted that because of my severe, medically documented dementia, I had absolutely no legal authority to invite the police onto the private estate or authorize any kind of search warrant whatsoever. He arrogantly demanded that they vacate the property entirely right now. He even tried to step past the detective to approach the medical stretcher, claiming he had the legal right to take custody of Yvonne on behalf of my son, Kendrick. The sheer unmitigated, absolute audacity of these corrupt men made my blood boil with intense, violent rage. They were looking right at my starving, freezing, dying wife, and they still wanted to use their fake legal papers to drag her back into the dark. I let go of Yvonne's cold hand and took a heavy step toward the arrogant lawyer, entirely ready to completely break his jaw right there today. But Detective Russo stepped completely in front of me, blocking my path. The seasoned police veteran looked at the thick stack of legal documents in his hand, and then looked directly into the arrogant face of the lead defense attorney. Russo did not look intimidated or confused. He looked absolutely, furiously, dangerously angry today. Detective Russo calmly dropped the thick stack of legal documents onto the wet, frozen grass. The arrogant lawyer opened his mouth to scream a threat, but Russo moved much faster. The detective grabbed the lawyer by the lapels of his expensive, tailored gray suit right away. Russo violently slammed him against the side of the black luxury car. The sudden physical impact dented the expensive metal frame loudly. Russo pulled out his heavy metal handcuffs and violently twisted the lawyer's arms behind his back, locking the cold steel tightly around his wrists. The other expensive attorneys stepped back in absolute profound shock, holding their hands up in the freezing air, entirely terrified by the sudden, aggressive, violent police action. Russo leaned in close to the arrested lawyer and spoke in a voice loud enough for everyone on the lawn to hear clearly tonight, absolutely right now. He officially arrested the lead defense attorney for direct criminal obstruction of justice and active interference with a major felony investigation. Russo ordered his tactical officers to detain the other 4 lawyers immediately. He looked over his shoulder at me and gave a sharp, quick nod telling me to get inside the waiting ambulance directly right away. I climbed into the brightly lit vehicle, sitting down right beside Yvonne as the heavy doors slammed shut. I held her fragile hand tightly, completely, realizing that the actual brutal legal war against Judge Sterling had truly just completely started tonight, right now. The sterile smell of the hospital room was a sharp contrast to the damp, freezing basement we had just escaped. I sat beside the stark white bed holding Yvonne's frail hand. The doctors had finally stabilized her weak heart and administered warm intravenous fluids to reverse the severe dehydration. Watching her sleep peacefully for the first time in 8 years gave me a profound sense of quiet relief, but it also fueled the absolute burning rage deep inside my chest. I gently kissed her fragile knuckles and whispered a quiet promise that I would completely destroy them all today forever. I walked out into the brightly lit hospital corridor, leaving 2 armed police officers guarding her door. Detective Russo had arrested Chloe and her arrogant lawyers, but I knew the local police station could not hold them for long. Judge Sterling possessed enough dark political power to manipulate the legal system and force her release on bail. I needed to completely obliterate their financial foundation before they could completely escape justice. I reached into my heavy winter coat pocket and pulled out my small black burner phone, dialing a number I had saved for a truly catastrophic worst-case scenario. I called a man named Marcus Vance. He was not a traditional gentle lawyer or a polite financial advisor. He was a completely ruthless forensic accountant who specialized in dismantling incredibly complex financial fraud for federal agencies. Marcus owed me a massive favor from 20 years ago when I helped his family keep their small business building during a brutal gentrification wave. I told him I needed his absolute best work immediately. He arrived at the hospital cafeteria exactly 40 minutes later, carrying a heavy encrypted laptop and a serious expression that told me he was completely ready today now. I handed Marcus the small silver flash drive containing all the horrific biometric data and the encrypted financial ledgers I had stolen from Chloe's computer. We sat in the empty hospital cafeteria drinking bitter black coffee as his nimble fingers danced across his glowing keyboard. He bypassed her basic security firewalls in less than 5 minutes. The screen flooded with thousands of highly detailed banking transactions and complex offshore wire transfers. I watched his eyes narrow as he began tracking the massive flow of my stolen wealth. The sheer volume of the calculated theft was absolutely incredibly staggering indeed today. Marcus discovered that Chloe was not just taking the mandatory biometric trust fund distributions every 6 months. She had used those distributions to artificially inflate my son Kendrick's credit score and secure massive predatory loans against the total value of the remaining estate. But the liquid cash was only a small fraction of their horrific ultimate master plan. Marcus opened a hidden directory showing a complex web of obscure corporate entities and deeply layered shell companies. He traced the digital paper trail backward through several dummy corporations registered in completely anonymous tax havens located far outside the local country today. The forensic accountant pointed a pen at the glowing screen, revealing the absolute worst betrayal of all. Chloe had systematically forged my signature and used her corrupt legal power of attorney to completely transfer the physical property deeds of my entire historic neighborhood. When Yvonne and I started our business, we bought dozens of residential properties in our predominantly black community to protect our neighbors from greedy corporate developers. We rented them out at deeply affordable rates to keep families in their long-time homes. Chloe had quietly stolen every single one of those valuable historical property deeds entirely recently. She had completely transferred ownership of 2 entire city blocks to a single massive anonymous shell company. I felt a cold, sickening knot form in the pit of my stomach as I realized the absolute devastating magnitude of her horrific crime. She was not just robbing my family, she was actively destroying an entire vibrant community to line her own expensive silk pockets. If she liquidated those properties, hundreds of innocent, hardworking people would be brutally evicted from their homes within weeks. I asked Marcus to completely unmask the true anonymous owner of that massive holding shell company today now. It took him another grueling 10 minutes of intense rapid typing and bypassing heavily guarded corporate firewalls to finally break through the absolute final layer of digital security. He pulled up the original articles of incorporation. The holding company was a major real estate syndicate secretly owned and entirely operated by Judge Thomas Sterling. Chloe's wealthy father was using his daughter to illegally swallow up prime urban real estate without leaving any obvious fingerprints on the actual crime scene. They were working completely together to legally steal everything Yvonne and I had built up over 40 long, hard-working years. But the digital autopsy revealed something even more terrifying than the theft itself. Marcus found a highly confidential pending sale agreement buried deep inside the corporate files. Judge Sterling and Chloe were currently in the absolute final stages of selling the entire historic neighborhood to a massive foreign investment firm for $80 million in pure, untraceable liquid cash. The massive financial transaction was explicitly scheduled to be fully executed and completely finalized in exactly 48 hours. Once the digital funds cleared the bank, the foreign investors would instantly tear down the entire neighborhood without any mercy whatsoever today. I realized exactly why Chloe had been so incredibly desperate to keep the horrific illusion alive during her expensive charity gala tonight. They were incredibly close to crossing the final absolute finish line now. Marcus looked at me with a completely grim expression and explained that if we did not freeze every single one of those stolen assets before the 48-hour deadline expired, the money would vanish into completely untouchable offshore accounts forever. Chloe and her powerful father would immediately take the massive, enormous pile of stolen liquid cash and completely avoid the impending criminal fallout today forever. We had less than 2 days to completely stop a massive corrupt financial machine that had been silently operating in the dark for 8 long years. I told Marcus we needed to freeze the main accounts immediately, right now, today. He vigorously shook his head, explaining that a standard police report would never be enough to freeze a transaction of this massive, incredible magnitude. We needed absolute, undeniable proof of severe internal banking fraud to trigger an automatic federal financial hold. He began digging furiously into the specific routing numbers and the official digital signatures approving the massive transfers today. Every time Chloe had moved millions of dollars out of my secure trust fund or illegally transferred a property deed, the massive transaction required the explicit authorized approval of a senior executive manager at the primary regional bank. The forensic accountant pulled up the official digital approval forms on his bright laptop screen. We stared at the incredibly long list of fraudulent, massive financial transfers. Every single illegal transaction had been personally reviewed, approved, and completely authorized by the exact same senior executive bank manager. It was a completely enclosed, highly protected, corrupt inside job from start to finish indeed. I asked Marcus to find the exact name of the senior executive bank manager who had rubber-stamped the destruction of my entire life. I wanted to know the absolute true identity of the man who had happily traded his professional integrity to help a vicious monster keep my beautiful wife locked in a freezing dark basement. Marcus quickly cross-referenced the official employee identification numbers with the public corporate registry of the massive regional bank. The bright computer screen flashed as the final encrypted personnel file slowly downloaded and opened right in front of my very tired eyes today. I stared at the high-resolution corporate photograph of the smiling executive bank manager on the bright screen. He had the exact same arrogant, sharp features and the exact same cold, calculating eyes as the woman who had slapped my son and ordered him to throw garbage at his starving mother. The senior executive manager approving all the fraudulent massive transfers was none other than Chloe's own biological brother. The absolute extreme level of deep family corruption was truly incredibly staggering. The powerful judge, the vicious daughter, and the banker brother had built a completely perfect, impenetrable criminal triangle today. They completely controlled the local law, the massive finances, and the dark, terrifying basement. They absolutely believed their white privilege and their massive stolen wealth made them completely untouchable, invincible gods in this city. But they had made one massive, incredibly stupid, fatal mistake. They had left me alive in the dark, freezing guest house, with enough time to finally understand exactly how their wicked machine was built. I looked at Marcus and told him to prepare the massive financial files for the Federal Bureau immediately. The ultimate, brutal, merciless counterstrike was officially finally starting right here, now today. The morning sun rose over Atlanta, casting a cold light on the city. I did not go to the local press. I did not stand in front of television cameras crying about my broken family. That is exactly what victims do, and I was completely done being a victim. I left the hospital after ensuring Yvonne was surrounded by private armed guards I had hired with my remaining clean funds. I drove my old truck straight to the massive federal building downtown. I bypassed the corrupt local police entirely and walked directly into the heavily guarded Federal Bureau of Investigation. I demanded to speak to the special agent in charge of severe financial crimes. They tried to make me wait in the lobby like a confused old man. I simply placed the thick forensic accounting report and the silver flash drive on the front desk. I told the receptionist that I was handing over absolute undeniable proof of a massive $80 million wire fraud involving a highly corrupt local judge and a senior executive bank manager. That got their immediate attention right away. Two tall federal agents in dark suits quickly escorted me into a secure, soundproof conference room. They looked at me with deep skepticism at first. They probably thought I was just another bitter old man making wild, impossible accusations against incredibly powerful, wealthy, elite people today. I sat across the metal table and let the digital evidence do all the talking. Marcus had organized the files perfectly. The agents opened the laptop and stared in absolute shocked silence at the high-definition video feed of Yvonne locked in the dark, freezing basement. I watched their professional composure completely shatter as they listened to the horrific audio recordings of Chloe threatening to freeze my starving wife tonight. Then I showed them the detailed internet protocol logs proving that the hidden basement camera was directly routed to the personal smartphone of Judge Thomas Sterling. The corruption was not just a family matter anymore. It was a massive, violent, organized criminal conspiracy. The lead federal agent took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He told me that building a federal case against a sitting judge and a major regional bank would take months of careful secret investigation. I leaned forward, resting my heavy, worn hands on the cold metal table. I told him we did not have months. I told him the massive illegal real estate transaction transferring my entire historic neighborhood to a foreign investment firm was scheduled to completely clear the global banking system in exactly 48 hours. If they did not freeze those specific offshore accounts immediately, the money and the criminals would permanently vanish into the absolute dark forever. The urgency in the room shifted instantly. The federal agents realized they were sitting on the largest active financial crime in the history of the entire state. They immediately brought in their own elite cybersecurity team to verify the biometric forgery evidence today. They saw exactly how Chloe had forced Yvonne to use her voice and thumbprint under extreme physical duress to illegally authorize the massive trust fund withdrawals. They saw the digital signature of Chloe's arrogant brother approving every single one of those fraudulent transactions at the regional bank. The federal machine finally woke up, and it was completely hungry for absolute, total, brutal justice against these arrogant, wealthy monsters today. While the federal agents were scrambling to secure the massive financial warrants, my black burner phone suddenly vibrated in my heavy winter coat pocket. I stepped out into the quiet hallway. I stepped out into the quiet federal hallway to look at the bright screen. The local news was already reporting that Chloe had been officially released from the county jail. Her powerful, corrupt father had easily arranged a massive $5 million cash bail through his shady syndicate connections. She was out walking entirely free, just hours after being caught torturing my beautiful wife. My blood boiled with intense, violent rage, but I forced my mind to remain completely cold and entirely calculating right now, today. The text message on my burner phone was from an unknown encrypted phone number. I knew exactly who was sending it. It was Chloe. She was incredibly arrogant, and she still firmly believed she was completely invincible. The text message was long and dripping with absolute venomous hatred. She wrote that I had my pathetic wife back and that I should consider myself incredibly lucky. She demanded that I drop all the criminal charges and formally retract my statements to the local police immediately. She threatened that if I did not comply, she would use her father's massive wealth to drag my entire family legacy through the absolute thickest mud in open criminal court. She typed that she would hire the most ruthless media smear experts in the country. She promised to invent horrible, disgusting lies about Yvonne. She threatened to tell the world that my beautiful wife was a severe drug addict who chose to lock herself in that basement out of deep psychological shame. She said she would completely destroy the historic neighborhood anyway, just out of pure spite. She ended the text message by reminding me that she was young and incredibly rich, while I was just a tired old man who would probably die of another severe, sudden heart attack. She thought her dark threats would paralyze me with absolute fear. She fundamentally misunderstood the man she was dealing with. 8 years ago, her cruel lies had broken my heart. But today, her pathetic, empty threats meant absolutely nothing to me. I was no longer playing a defensive game. I had completely seized the entire offensive board. I did not reply to her text message with angry words or emotional insults. I did not type out a long, passionate defense of my innocent wife. Words were completely useless against a vicious sociopath like my daughter-in-law right now today. I needed to send her a message that she could completely, deeply, absolutely understand in her cold, dark, greedy heart today, right now. I walked back into the secure conference room. The lead federal agent was holding his phone, looking incredibly satisfied. He told me that a massive, heavily armed federal strike team had just violently breached the main doors of the regional bank downtown. They were executing the immediate arrest warrants we had just secured. I asked the agent a very simple favor. I asked him to send me a single live photograph from the active financial bank raid. He nodded and tapped his screen. A moment later, my burner phone buzzed with a high-resolution image taken by a federal agent inside the luxurious corporate bank office just a few miles away. The photograph was absolutely beautiful. It showed Chloe's arrogant brother, the senior executive bank manager, lying completely flat on his expensive office floor. His expensive tailored suit was completely ruined. 2 heavily armed federal agents were pressing their heavy boots into his back while forcibly locking thick steel handcuffs around his wrists. His face was twisted in absolute, pure, unadulterated terror, looking exactly, incredibly, completely pathetic. He looked exactly like the pathetic, cowardly criminal he truly was. The background of the photo showed federal investigators aggressively seizing all his computer servers and boxing up the fraudulent physical documents. His corrupt banking career and his entire luxurious life were completely over forever today. I looked at the bright screen of my burner phone and smiled a very cold, dark smile. I attached the high-resolution photograph of her brother being violently arrested to my text message thread with Chloe. I did not include a single word of text. I did not need to add any dramatic warnings. The digital picture was the absolute, ultimate, devastating response to her pathetic threats. I pressed send and watched the small progress bar confirm the secure delivery. I stood in the quiet federal hallway, imagining the exact look of total, horrific panic washing over her pale face as she opened that specific message right now. I knew exactly how a terrified rat reacts when the final escape route is suddenly completely blocked. Chloe realized that her powerful father could not protect her from the massive federal government. She realized that her brother had been captured and would definitely testify entirely truthfully. Her $5 million bail meant absolutely nothing now because she was facing massive federal charges of domestic terrorism, wire fraud, and kidnapping. The local police could be bought, but the federal machine was entirely, completely, totally out of her corrupt control. She only had one single desperate option left to completely avoid spending the rest of her life in prison today. She had to run. She had to flee the country immediately before the federal agents froze her secret offshore travel funds. She was already driving incredibly fast toward the private airport tarmac, preparing to board her escape jet. I walked out of the federal building and immediately climbed into the driver's seat of my heavy steel work truck. Detective Russo was already running toward his unmarked police cruiser parked right across the street. We knew exactly where Chloe was heading because the federal cyber team had just tracked her burner phone signal. She was moving incredibly fast toward the private executive airstrip located on the wealthy northern edge of Atlanta. If her expensive jet left the runway, she would vanish into an untouchable country, and my beautiful wife would never see true, absolute justice in her lifetime today. I started the loud diesel engine and slammed my heavy foot onto the gas pedal. I followed closely behind Detective Russo as he flipped on his bright flashing sirens and tore through the busy downtown traffic. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. I thought about the sheer arrogance of my incredibly cruel daughter-in-law. She truly believed that her massive stolen wealth and her powerful corrupt father could simply buy her a permanent ticket out of any horrific crime she committed. She was about to learn a very painful lesson today. The loud sirens cleared the busy highway, allowing us to drive at incredibly dangerous speeds. I pushed my heavy work truck to its absolute mechanical limit. This was the exact same truck I had used to haul steel beams and concrete blocks when I built my massive real estate empire from the ground up. Today, it was going to haul pure absolute justice. We approached the private airstrip just as the sun climbed higher into the cold winter sky. Through the tall chain-link fence, I could clearly see a sleek white private jet sitting on the tarmac waiting completely. The jet engines were already whining loudly, preparing for an immediate emergency takeoff. Detective Russo slammed on his brakes, skidding to a violent halt right in front of the main security gate. I parked my heavy truck right behind his police cruiser. The front gate was completely blocked by 3 large black armored sport utility vehicles. 6 heavily armed private security contractors were standing in front of the gate holding heavy tactical rifles. They were employed directly by the powerful Judge Thomas Sterling, and they were ordered to stop absolutely anyone who tried to approach the private jet quickly today. Detective Russo stepped out of his vehicle and proudly held up his gold police badge. He ordered the private security men to open the gate immediately because he had federal warrants for the absolute immediate arrest of Chloe Sterling. The lead security contractor just smiled a cold, arrogant smile. He kept his heavy rifle resting across his chest and completely refused to move an inch. He claimed they were standing on strictly private property and that Russo had absolutely no legal jurisdiction without a physical paper warrant signed by a state judge. It was a massive intentional delay tactic completely. The corrupt security team knew they could not shoot a police detective, but they also knew they only needed to delay him for exactly 3 minutes. I looked through the tall steel fence and watched the sleek white jet slowly begin to roll forward. The pilot was moving the plane onto the active runway to escape. The wealthy elite always used their private armies to build walls between themselves and the harsh consequences of their terrible actions. Russo grabbed his police radio to call for heavily armed federal backup, but the screaming jet engines told me time was completely gone. I was not going to let her fly away after she kept my wife locked in a freezing concrete box for 8 long years. I looked at the heavy steel gate and the arrogant private security contractors blocking the path. I climbed back into the driver's seat of my massive, heavy work truck. I shifted the loud transmission into drive and stared directly through the dirty windshield. I did not care about the armed men or their expensive armored vehicles. I pressed my heavy work boot entirely down to the floorboard and aggressively accelerated the massive roaring diesel engine immediately. The heavy truck surged forward with terrifying, absolute violent power. Detective Russo saw what I was doing and immediately dove completely out of the way. The private security contractors' arrogant smiles instantly vanished from their faces as my massive steel grill charged directly toward them. They scrambled completely in panic, dropping their heavy rifles and diving wildly into the frozen grass to avoid being completely crushed. My truck violently slammed into the tall steel security gate with a massive, deafening metallic crash that shook my entire body entirely. The heavy metal chains snapped like fragile little plastic strings, breaking easily. The massive steel gates flew violently open, tearing completely off their heavy metal hinges. My heavy truck launched onto the restricted private tarmac, violently crushing the expensive landscaping. I kept the gas pedal pressed firmly down to the floor. The sleek white private jet was picking up massive speed, moving rapidly down the long gray runway. I violently twisted the steering wheel, driving my heavy truck completely parallel to the roaring aircraft. The deafening sound of the massive jet engines was absolutely overwhelming, but I focused my entire tired mind entirely on the front wheels of the huge airplane completely. I could see Chloe looking out of the small oval window of the expensive jet. Her face was pressed against the thick glass, and her expression was completely frozen in absolute, pure, unadulterated terror. She finally realized that the old man she had tortured and underestimated was entirely unstoppable today. The airplane was moving incredibly fast, but my heavy diesel truck was entirely built for incredible raw power. I pushed the engine past its absolute red line, screaming loudly inside the heavy metal cab. I violently jerked the steering wheel hard to the right, cutting directly across the huge empty runway. I slammed my massive truck directly into the path of the speeding jet and slammed both feet heavily onto the brake pedal. The heavy work truck skidded violently sideways across the rough concrete, sending thick clouds of white tire smoke completely into the freezing air. The massive truck came to a complete sudden stop directly in front of the airplane's massive front landing gear. The airplane pilot immediately realized he was going to crash into a solid wall of thick steel. He completely aborted the takeoff, slamming on the massive aircraft brakes and reversing the screaming, loud jet engines fast. The private jet violently shuddered and screeched against the runway concrete, stopping less than 10 feet away from my heavy steel door. The deafening roar of the jet engines slowly whined down into a completely defeated, low mechanical hum. I sat in the driver's seat, breathing incredibly heavily, gripping the steering wheel as the thick white smoke slowly cleared from the runway. I had successfully completely stopped the escape. Within absolute seconds, 5 black, armored federal vehicles smashed through the broken gate I had just destroyed. Heavily armed federal agents poured out onto the tarmac, entirely surrounding the big plane. Detective Russo ran across the runway holding his heavy service weapon pointed directly at the main cabin door of the trapped jet. The federal agents rolled a mobile staircase directly up to the side of the expensive aircraft. They aggressively banged on the thick fuselage, demanding the absolute immediate surrender of everyone inside. The pilot wisely opened the hydraulic cabin door and stepped out with his hands raised completely high in the air. The federal agents stormed inside the luxurious cabin, completely ready for absolutely any violent resistance from the arrogant, corrupt, wealthy woman hiding inside right now today. A few seconds later, Chloe was violently dragged out of the expensive jet by 2 large federal agents. She was kicking and completely thrashing her body like a wild, desperate animal. Her expensive designer clothing was wrinkled and completely ruined. Her expensive, perfect blonde hair was a chaotic, tangled, absolute mess. She was screaming horrific, racist obscenities at the federal agents, entirely losing her fake, elegant, high society facade forever. They dragged her down the metal stairs and violently pushed her face down onto the cold, hard runway concrete, snapping thick, heavy steel handcuffs tightly around her bare wrists. I slowly opened the door of my heavy truck and stepped down onto the tarmac. Chloe looked up at me from the cold concrete, her face completely twisted in pure, venomous hatred and absolute pathetic defeat. She was no longer the powerful, wealthy princess of Atlanta high society. She was just an absolutely pathetic, violent criminal, completely trapped by her own terrifying arrogance and horrific, unpardonable greed. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no pity in my entire tired soul. I knew that the absolute brutal reckoning for her and my son had officially, entirely, permanently just begun today. Driving to the maximum security federal detention center took exactly 1 hour of complete, uninterrupted silence. I did not turn on the radio. I just watched the gray Atlanta skyline slowly pass by through the dirty windshield of my heavy truck. I was mentally preparing myself to completely, permanently execute the absolute, final, total destruction of my only living child. The heavy steel doors of the Fulton County Jail slammed shut behind me, echoing with a hollow, metallic thud. The air inside the maximum security visitor center smelled of cheap industrial bleach and absolute despair. I sat down at the cold metal table, bolted directly to the concrete floor. I was waiting for my son Kendrick. 48 hours ago, he was standing in a luxurious grand ballroom wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, drinking premium champagne bought with my stolen money. Today, he was a federal inmate facing decades in a concrete box. A heavy metal door on the opposite side of the stark room suddenly clicked open loudly. 2 large armed corrections officers escorted Kendrick into the visiting area. He was wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit that looked completely humiliating on him. His wrists and ankles were bound by thick, heavy steel chains that rattled loudly with every single pathetic step he took. He looked absolutely terrible today. The arrogant, completely confident posture he always carried was completely gone. His face was incredibly pale and covered in a thick layer of nervous sweat. He had dark, heavy bags under his incredibly bloodshot eyes, showing he had not slept a single minute since his arrest. He sat down heavily in the metal chair across from me, resting his chained hands on the cold table. He looked at me with a completely desperate, pathetic expression, hoping to find some small trace of paternal sympathy in my tired 72-year-old eyes. But my eyes were completely dead to him. I felt absolutely nothing for the broken criminal sitting across from me right now today. Kendrick immediately leaned forward and started talking incredibly fast. His voice was trembling violently and his words were completely desperate. He told me that this entire situation was a massive, terrible misunderstanding. He cried that the county jail was absolutely horrific and that the other violent inmates were constantly threatening his life. He begged me to contact my expensive lawyers and arrange for his immediate release on bail today. He aggressively claimed that he never wanted to hurt his mother at all. He loudly blamed everything on his incredibly evil wife, Chloe, and her completely corrupt, powerful father, Judge Sterling. He swore to me that Chloe had manipulated his finances, threatened his entire career, and completely forced him to participate in the massive, horrific financial fraud. He said he was absolutely terrified of her wealthy family and their dark criminal syndicate connections. He told me he only went along with the terrible plan to protect his own young innocent children from her violent wrath. He looked directly into my cold eyes and played his absolute final pathetic desperate card. He told me he was my only son. He said he was my own flesh and blood and that a true father could never abandon his own child in a dark, terrifying prison cell. He cried thick, heavy tears, begging me to remember all the good times we shared when he was just a little innocent boy growing up in Atlanta. He demanded that I use my newly recovered wealth to save him because family is supposed to stick together no matter what terrible things happen. I sat there in absolute total silence, simply watching his pathetic mouth move. Every single word he spoke was a calculated, cowardly lie designed entirely to save his own miserable skin from absolute severe federal punishment right now today. I did not interrupt his pathetic sobbing monologue. I let him entirely, completely exhaust himself with his desperate, cowardly excuses. I looked at his shaking, chained hands and remembered the live video feed of those exact same hands aggressively shoving a plastic tray of discarded garbage through a metal slot into a freezing, dark basement. I remembered the incredibly cold, arrogant tone of his voice when he told his starving mother to shut her mouth and eat her garbage because he had wealthy, important friends upstairs. He was not a helpless, innocent victim of a wicked, evil, manipulative wife. He was an entirely willing, active participant who happily traded his own mother life for expensive luxury cars and high society status. He completely loved the massive stolen wealth and the powerful, corrupt connections far more than he ever loved his own family. I slowly reached my right hand inside my heavy winter coat pocket. Kendrick suddenly stopped crying and looked at my hand with a small, pathetic glimmer of false hope. He actually completely believed I was pulling out a pristine checkbook to post his massive, expensive federal bail today. He completely believed that my paternal love was a permanent, easily exploitable weakness that he could use whenever he was in terrible, deep trouble. But I did not pull out a checkbook. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents carefully prepared by my incredibly ruthless forensic accountant and my newly hired aggressive legal team. I placed the thick, heavy papers directly onto the cold metal table and slowly slid them across the smooth surface until they stopped exactly right in front of his chained, trembling, sweaty hands right now, completely today. Kendrick stared down at the thick legal documents with a completely confused expression. He asked me what these papers were, expecting them to be his official bail release forms. I kept my voice incredibly low and entirely, completely cold. I told him that the top document was a total, complete, absolute legal disownment. I explained that by signing that specific paper, he was officially, legally severing all familial ties with me and his mother Yvonne forever. He would be completely, permanently removed from the $15 million family trust fund. He would absolutely never inherit a single penny of the massive generational wealth we had spent 40 long, hard years building. He would have absolutely no legal claim to any of our historic real estate properties or our incredibly valuable liquid assets today, tomorrow, or ever again. Kendrick's face turned completely stark white as the terrifying, absolute reality of my cold words hit him. But I was not finished completely destroying his pathetic life yet. I pointed my heavy, tired finger at the second thick document resting on the cold metal table. I told him that the second document was a full, complete, voluntary relinquishment of all his legal parental rights to his two young children. I told him that his corrupt, evil wife, Chloe, was currently facing massive federal domestic terrorism charges and would absolutely spend the rest of her miserable life in a maximum security federal prison. Both of them were completely, entirely unfit to ever raise children again. I told him that Yvonne and I were taking absolute, full, permanent legal custody of our beautiful, innocent grandchildren right now today. We were going to raise them in a safe, loving home far away from his toxic, horrific, greedy, pathetic, corrupt, absolute, terrible influence forever. Kendrick completely panicked. He violently slammed his chained hands onto the metal table, screaming loudly that he would never, ever sign away his own beautiful children. He shouted that I was a completely crazy old man and that no judge would ever grant me full custody. I looked at him with an absolutely terrifying, cold, dead stare. I told him that the Federal Bureau currently had massive, undeniable proof of his severe involvement in the $80 million wire fraud and the horrific violent kidnapping of his own mother. I told him that if he did not sign the legal documents right now today, I would personally hand over all of his private encrypted communications to the aggressive federal prosecutors immediately. I promised him I would make absolutely sure he received the absolute maximum federal prison sentence possible without any chance of early parole ever. I told him he had exactly two choices today. He could sign the papers and I would simply let the federal justice system process him normally. Or he could refuse and I would spend every single remaining dollar of my massive fortune to completely, utterly, permanently destroy his entire existence in federal court. He looked at my cold face and finally completely realized he had absolutely no power left. He picked up the pen with trembling, crying hands and signed the papers. I took the documents back and stood up from the metal table. He begged me, saying he was my blood. I looked down at him and spoke my final words. You stopped being my blood the day you handed your mother a tray of scraps in the dark. I walked away, leaving him sobbing. The heavy oak doors of the downtown legal building closed behind me with a solid thud, shutting out the noise of the city. We were gathered in a massive conference room for the official civil and criminal depositions. The room was freezing cold and smelled of expensive leather and stale coffee. A bright red light blinked constantly on the video camera positioned at the end of the long mahogany table. That camera was recording every single breath and every single word for the official court record. I sat on one side of the massive table wearing a simple dark suit. My posture was completely straight and my hands were folded, calmly resting on the polished wood. Directly across from me sat Chloe. She was no longer wearing her expensive emerald gowns. She wore a conservative gray suit meant to make her look like a respectable, innocent victim, but her eyes were completely wild and heavily bloodshot. Next to her sat the new lead defense attorney hired by her powerful father. He was a highly paid legal shark famous for completely destroying the credibility of opposing witnesses. He opened his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of medical records. He looked at me with a completely arrogant and highly patronizing smile. He was entirely ready to paint me as a confused, pathetic old man who simply forgot where his wife was. The expensive lawyer began his aggressive questioning by focusing entirely on my advanced age and my medical history. He spoke to me in a slow, loud voice as if I were a small, foolish child who could not understand basic English. He listed the medications I took for my heart condition. He pointed out that I was 72 years old and had lived in a small guest house under the strict medical supervision of my son. He asked me if it was true that I sometimes forgot where I placed my house keys or my reading glasses. He suggested very smoothly that the horrific events of the charity gala were just a massive, unfortunate misunderstanding caused by my severe senile dementia. He claimed that Chloe and my son had simply hired a private nurse to care for Yvonne in a quiet, secure room to protect her from her own severe mental decline. The lawyer leaned forward, resting his elbows on the expensive table, and confidently stated that my aging, fragile mind had completely fabricated the entire kidnapping story out of pure paranoid delusion. Chloe sat next to him, looking incredibly smug and completely confident. She actually believed her expensive lawyer was successfully twisting the absolute truth right in front of the federal prosecutors and the court reporter. I did not interrupt him. I let him talk for 20 full minutes, perfectly demonstrating his complete arrogance. When he finally finished his insulting monologue, he leaned back in his leather chair and waited for me to lose my temper. He wanted me to shout and pound my fists on the table so the video camera would record an aggressive, unstable old black man. But I did not give him that satisfaction. I took a very slow, deep breath and looked directly into his cold eyes. My voice was completely steady and incredibly clear. I did not talk about my feelings or my broken heart. I talked like the master structural engineer I had been for 40 long years. I told the lawyer that the cinder block wall in the basement was exactly 9 feet tall and 14 feet wide. I told him it was constructed using cheap, unreinforced masonry blocks and a specific low-grade mortar that takes exactly 48 hours to fully cure in cold temperatures. I cited the exact building code violations. Then I moved to the financial ledgers. I recited from memory the exact routing numbers of the offshore shell companies Chloe had used to steal my real estate properties. I listed the specific dates and the exact times of 7 different unauthorized massive wire transfers down to the very last penny. The smug smile on the face of the expensive lawyer slowly began to melt away entirely. I looked right at Chloe and perfectly described the specific model number of the digital biometric scanner she used to steal the thumbprint of my wife. I recited the exact Internet Protocol address of the hidden night vision camera she had installed in the ceiling of the concrete cell. I provided the exact date when the original architectural blueprints of the mansion were illegally altered by her corrupt father. I did not stumble over a single word or hesitate for a single second. My memory was absolutely flawless and completely terrifying in its cold precision. I systematically dismantled every single pathetic lie the defense attorney had carefully built. The federal prosecutors sitting beside me furiously took notes, completely amazed by the overwhelming mountain of exact, undeniable, factual data pouring from my mouth. The defense attorney started sweating heavily, staining the collar of his expensive white shirt. He shuffled his medical records, completely losing his arrogant composure. He realized he was not fighting a confused old man with severe dementia. He was fighting a brilliant, calculated architect who had spent 8 long years entirely focused on this exact moment of absolute total destruction. Before the panicked defense attorney could even attempt to recover from my devastating testimony, the heavy doors of the conference room opened again. The entire room went completely dead silent. A medical orderly carefully pushed a modern silver wheelchair through the doorway. Sitting in the wheelchair was my beautiful Yvonne. She looked incredibly fragile, wearing a soft blue sweater that draped loosely over her thin shoulders. Her white hair was neatly combed, and her face was still pale from the severe lack of sunlight. But when she lifted her head and looked across the mahogany table, her eyes burned with the absolute fierce strength of a true survivor. The orderly positioned her wheelchair right next to my chair. I gently reached out and held her thin hand, completely anchoring her in this incredibly difficult moment. The court reporter prepared her machine. The federal prosecutor softly asked Yvonne to state her full name for the official legal record. Yvonne spoke in a very quiet but incredibly clear voice that carried absolute, undeniable, absolute heavy truth. She did not sound confused, and she did not sound crazy. She sounded exactly like a strong, proud woman who had walked through hell and entirely survived to tell the story today. The defense attorney tried to object to her presence, claiming she was entirely medically unfit to testify right now. But the federal prosecutors completely ignored his pathetic, desperate protests. Yvonne looked directly at Chloe for the first time in 8 years. Chloe physically shrank back into her leather chair, completely terrified by the calm, piercing gaze of the woman she had tortured. Yvonne began to describe the exact horrific conditions of the dark basement. She did not exaggerate or cry. She simply stated the cold, brutal, undeniable facts. She described the terrible freezing temperatures during the winter months. She explained exactly how Chloe would withhold food and clean water for days until Yvonne was completely weak enough to press her thumb against the glowing biometric scanner. She repeated the exact cruel words Chloe had spoken to her in the dark. She told the room how Chloe had laughed and said the life of an old black woman was completely worthless compared to the massive wealth of the family trust fund. Every single word Yvonne spoke was a heavy driving nail, completely sealing the absolute final coffin of the expensive defense strategy. The court reporter had tears in her eyes as she typed the horrific testimony. The high-paid defense attorney completely dropped his expensive pen onto the table. He knew his legal case was absolutely entirely dead. There was no possible way to cross-examine Yvonne without looking like an absolute cruel monster in front of a federal judge. The undeniable truth of her quiet, dignified testimony was the most powerful weapon in the entire room. She described how my son Kendrick had thrown garbage at her like she was a stray dog. She completely shattered the fake narrative that this was just a simple medical misunderstanding. It was a highly organized, brutal kidnapping designed entirely for maximum financial profit. The federal prosecutors looked at Chloe with absolute pure professional disgust. Chloe was completely cornered. Her expensive lawyers could not save her. Her powerful father could not save her now. The absolute reality of spending the rest of her natural life in a dark, concrete federal prison cell finally violently crashed down upon her incredibly arrogant, completely selfish mind today. Chloe began to physically shake. Her perfect, wealthy posture completely collapsed. She looked around the silent conference room, realizing that every single person present viewed her as an absolute twisted evil monster. She had spent her entire life controlling the narrative, using her money and her skin color to completely manipulate the world around her. She absolutely could not handle being completely stripped of her power and exposed as a pathetic, desperate criminal. The intense pressure inside her mind completely snapped. She suddenly stood up from her leather chair, knocking it violently backward onto the carpet. Her face turned a deep, bright, angry red. She grabbed the heavy glass of cold water resting on the mahogany table right in front of her. With a sudden, violent shriek of absolute, pure, unhinged rage, she threw the heavy glass directly across the massive table, aiming right at my face today. I did not even flinch. The heavy glass missed my head by an inch and violently shattered against the wood paneling of the wall behind me, spraying cold water and sharp glass shards everywhere. The federal prosecutors jumped to their feet in absolute shock. The defense attorney desperately grabbed the arm of Chloe, trying to pull her back down into her chair. But Chloe violently shoved her own lawyer away. She completely lost her mind right in front of the blinking red light of the recording video camera. She pointed her shaking finger at me and Yvonne and began screaming the most horrific, vile, racist slurs imaginable. She screamed that we were completely disgusting and that we absolutely deserved to rot in the dark forever. She shouted that her powerful white family built this city and that people like us were entirely meant to serve people like her. She completely abandoned any absolute remaining completely tiny shred of basic human decency. Her hateful, violent, racist screaming echoed loudly off the walls of the small conference room. The video camera quietly recorded every single horrific word she shouted. The court reporter typed furiously, capturing the absolute total destruction of the victim defense strategy. By completely losing her temper and screaming those terrible racist words, Chloe legally proved exactly who she truly was. She proved to the federal government that she was motivated by extreme racial hatred and pure violent greed. She proved that she was entirely capable of treating another human being like an animal. 2 armed court bailiffs rushed into the room and aggressively grabbed her by the arms, completely ignoring her pathetic, violent thrashing. They dragged her out of the deposition room as she continued to scream incredibly horrible, vile, terrible insults at my wife. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her, cutting off her pathetic, desperate screaming entirely. I sat perfectly still, holding the warm hand of my beautiful wife. We looked at the completely shocked faces of the federal prosecutors and the deeply humiliated defense attorney. The legal war was essentially completely, absolutely over today. The wicked monster had willingly built her own permanent, unbreakable cage right in front of the entire, completely watching world today. The federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta looked like a heavily fortified military zone. Hundreds of reporters and bright news cameras surrounded the massive concrete building every single morning. The criminal trial of my daughter-in-law Chloe and my own son Kendrick had completely dominated the national news cycle for 6 agonizing weeks. They called it the trial of the decade. The wealthy elite of the city were completely terrified that their own dark secrets would be exposed by the aggressive federal prosecutors. I walked through the massive crowd of shouting journalists every single day, holding my beautiful wife Yvonne closely by my side. We did not give any interviews or make any public statements to the hungry press. We simply walked up the heavy stone steps and took our seats in the front row of the crowded courtroom. Inside the room, the atmosphere was incredibly heavy and entirely suffocating. The federal prosecutors presented an absolute mountain of undeniable forensic evidence. They played the horrific audio recordings of Chloe torturing my starving wife. They projected the stark night vision video of the freezing basement cell onto a massive screen for the entire jury to see clearly. They brought in Chloe's corrupt brother, the former bank manager, who completely turned against his own family to save himself from a life sentence. He testified for 3 full days, explaining exactly how the $80 million real estate theft was entirely orchestrated by his powerful father, Judge Thomas Sterling. Chloe sat at the defense table looking completely pale and entirely exhausted. Her expensive makeup could not hide the deep, dark circles under her terrified eyes. Her high-priced defense lawyers tried their absolute best to confuse the jury, but the physical evidence was simply too massive and completely undeniable today. The final closing arguments from the lead federal prosecutor were absolutely devastating. He pointed directly at Chloe and called her a ruthless, greedy monster who used her extreme wealth and white privilege to enslave an innocent, elderly black woman. He demanded absolute justice for the 8 horrific years my wife spent locked in the dark. The defense lawyers offered a completely weak, pathetic closing statement, asking the jury to consider the complicated psychological stress of managing a large family estate. absolutely nobody in the entirely packed courtroom believed a single pathetic word they desperately said today. When the judge finally handed the complex case over to the jury, the real psychological torture began. The jury deliberation is a terrifying period of complete unknown silence. You can have all the undeniable evidence in the entire world, but 12 strangers ultimately hold the absolute final power over your entire life. Yvonne and I sat in a small private waiting room down the long marble hallway from the main courtroom. The agonizing hours dragged on incredibly slowly like thick, heavy frozen mud. One entire day passed without any word from the jury room. Then a second full day passed in absolute agonizing silence. The national news anchors began completely wildly speculating that the jury was deadlocked or struggling with the massive complex financial fraud charges. The intense waiting period was incredibly tense and physically exhausting for my tired old bones. I drank completely terrible bitter coffee from small paper cups and paced back and forth across the small room. I watched the clock on the wall slowly tick away the long afternoon hours. My beautiful wife sat quietly reading a book, completely trusting that the absolute truth would finally prevail today. But my mind was incredibly restless and deeply suspicious. I knew exactly how incredibly powerful and incredibly corrupt Judge Thomas Sterling truly was. He was not on trial yet because the Federal Bureau was still building the massive separate racketeering case against his entire hidden criminal syndicate. He was currently completely free on bail, sitting in his own massive luxury mansion, watching his daughter face absolute total ruin. I knew he would never simply allow the justice system to operate fairly. A man who steals entire neighborhoods and helps kidnap elderly women does not suddenly respect the rule of law. I felt a very cold, dark, completely terrifying suspicion slowly creeping up my tired spine right now. I pulled my burner phone from my pocket and immediately called the lead federal agent in charge of the massive financial investigation. I told him my deep, absolute, completely terrifying suspicion about the powerful, corrupt judge. I explained that a man like Thomas Sterling would absolutely attempt to use his massive hidden wealth to completely compromise the entire jury or even the presiding trial judge today. The federal agent listened to my incredibly urgent words very carefully. I suggested that they immediately implement an emergency highly classified federal wiretap on the personal financial accounts and private communication devices of the presiding trial judge himself. The federal agent was completely shocked by my bold suggestion, but he knew my instincts had been absolutely flawless. Since the very first night I uncovered the dark basement cell, the Federal Bureau completely quietly secured the emergency surveillance warrants that very same afternoon. My dark, terrifying suspicion was entirely, absolutely, completely 100% correct. Late on the third night of the tense jury deliberations, the federal surveillance team intercepted a highly encrypted digital communication between Judge Thomas Sterling and the presiding trial judge handling our specific criminal case. Sterling was actively offering a massive $2 million untraceable offshore bribe in exchange for a completely forced mistrial ruling. He wanted the corrupt trial judge to completely dismiss the entire jury and completely ruin the federal prosecution entirely. But the Federal Bureau was already waiting in the absolute dark. They completely allowed the massive offshore wire transfer to initiate so they could capture the absolute undeniable digital proof of the incredibly corrupt massive bribe. Before the trial judge could even walk into the massive courthouse the next morning, heavily armed federal agents quietly arrested him in the dark underground parking garage. They placed thick steel handcuffs on his wrists and completely removed him from the entire high-profile criminal case. At the exact same time, another heavily armed federal tactical team violently raided the massive luxury estate of Judge Thomas Sterling, completely arresting him for massive judicial bribery and severe criminal racketeering today. A completely new, highly vetted federal judge was immediately sworn in to oversee the absolute final steps of our incredibly long criminal trial. The massive, shocking arrest of the original trial judge and the incredibly corrupt, powerful father was completely kept absolutely entirely secret from the deliberating jury to prevent any severe legal complications. On the afternoon of the fourth long, agonizing day, the wooden doors of the jury room finally slowly opened. The court bailiff loudly announced that the jury had absolutely completely reached a unanimous final verdict today. My heart hammered violently against my tired ribs as Yvonne and I walked back into the completely packed, silent courtroom. The cold air was incredibly thick, with absolute total, incredibly heavy anticipation. Chloe was escorted into the room by two armed federal marshals. She looked entirely, completely broken and absolutely incredibly terrified right now. Kendrick walked in right behind her, keeping his head entirely bowed, looking exactly like a pathetic, cowardly, completely defeated animal. The entirely new federal judge angrily demanded absolute, total, complete silence in the massive, completely crowded room. The jury foreperson stood up holding a small white piece of paper containing the absolute final fate of my completely destroyed family. The jury foreperson slowly read the incredibly long list of massive federal charges out loud to the room. For the massive, severe charge of aggravated kidnapping, the jury finds the defendant absolutely entirely guilty. The entire courtroom let out a massive collective gasp of absolute pure shock. For the severe charge of massive complex wire fraud, the jury finds the defendant entirely, completely guilty. For the horrific charge of severe elder abuse and physical torture, the jury finds the defendant absolutely guilty. They were found completely guilty on absolutely every single massive federal charge presented today. Chloe completely violently collapsed into her wooden chair, sobbing loudly and uncontrollably right in front of the entirely silent, stunned courtroom. Kendrick simply buried his sweating face in his shaking hands, crying completely pathetic, cowardly tears of absolute total regret. The federal marshals immediately moved forward to formally secure the convicted violent criminals. The incredibly powerful, corrupt, wealthy family was completely, finally, entirely, permanently destroyed today. The new federal judge banged his heavy wooden gavel, demanding total silence once again. He looked directly across the massive mahogany courtroom right at me, sitting completely calmly beside my beautiful, surviving wife. The entire crowded room turned their absolute full attention completely toward us right now today. The judge leaned forward, looking incredibly serious and entirely respectful today. He slowly asked me directly if I absolutely wanted to step forward and completely make an official public victim impact statement before he formally passed the absolute final, massive, incredibly severe prison sentences right now. The new federal judge leaned forward, looking incredibly serious and entirely respectful today. He slowly asked me directly if I absolutely wanted to step forward and completely make an official public victim impact statement before he formally passed the absolute final, massive, incredibly severe prison sentences right now. I slowly stood up from my solid wooden chair in the front row of the completely packed, silent courtroom. I gently let go of my beautiful wife, Yvonne's soft, warm hand. I adjusted the lapels of my simple dark suit and took a deep, steady breath. I did not walk up to the wooden podium with the slow, shuffling steps of a completely broken, defeated old man. I walked with the absolute, completely straight posture of a proud structural engineer who had just entirely successfully demolished a massively corrupt, incredibly toxic building. The heavy silence in the massive federal courtroom was completely deafening. Every single reporter, every single federal agent, and every single incredibly wealthy spectator watched my every single move with absolute, pure, total, undivided attention today. I stepped behind the thick wooden podium and looked directly up at the federal judge sitting high above the entire room. Then I slowly turned my head and looked directly at the defense table. Chloe and Kendrick were sitting there looking absolutely terrified today. I did not let my voice tremble or shake even a tiny little bit. I firmly gripped the edges of the solid wooden podium and spoke directly into the sensitive silver microphone, waiting for my powerful, truthful words. I told the federal judge and the entire crowded courtroom that I did not stand before them today to ask for any kind of human pity or soft emotional sympathy. I explained that pity is a completely useless emotion reserved entirely for helpless victims, and I was done being a helpless victim forever. I told them that for 8 incredibly long, agonizing, terrible years, my own son and his wealthy, cruel white wife had completely stolen my entire life. They stole my massive $15 million financial legacy. They stole my beautiful historic real estate properties. But absolutely worst of all, they violently stole the incredibly beautiful woman I loved completely. I pointed my heavy, tired finger directly at Chloe, who was violently trembling in her wooden chair. I told the entirely silent courtroom that this incredibly vicious, arrogant woman did not just commit a simple financial white-collar crime today. She committed an absolute, incredibly dark, horrific act of pure, unadulterated evil, domestic terrorism against a completely innocent, frail, elderly black woman. She used her massive extreme wealth and her incredibly powerful corrupt family connections to completely build a dark, freezing concrete dungeon inside my own completely beautiful home. I stared directly into Chloe's terrified, heavily bloodshot eyes. I told the federal judge that Chloe weaponized my advanced age, my deep emotional grief, and my own absolute paternal trust to completely enslave my incredibly beautiful wife. She entirely believed that her bright white skin and her massive stolen offshore bank accounts made her completely invincible to the local laws of this city today. She entirely laughed at our severe human suffering because she completely thought old black people were disposable objects meant only to serve her incredibly lavish, expensive high society lifestyle. I gripped the wooden podium tighter and raised my voice so every single person in the massive room could hear me clearly. I told the judge that this vicious, cruel monster destroyed her own fundamental humanity the very first time she forced Yvonne to starve in the freezing dark. I stated that I was requesting the absolute maximum severe prison sentence allowed by federal law. I demanded that she absolutely never be allowed to completely see the bright sunlight or breathe the fresh outside air as a completely free woman ever again. I told the judge she deserved to rot in a dark concrete cell for the exact incredibly long duration of her miserable natural life today. Then I slowly turned my cold, dead eyes entirely toward my completely broken, sobbing son, Kendrick. He could not even look up at my face. He kept his sweating head entirely bowed, crying pathetic, cowardly tears onto the heavy wooden defense table. I told the incredibly silent courtroom that the absolute ultimate worst betrayal does not come from the completely cold hands of a stranger. The absolute worst betrayal comes directly from your own flesh and blood today. I explained that I had sacrificed my own tired body and my own sweat for 40 long years to build an incredibly massive, beautiful life for that pathetic, cowardly boy today. I sent him to the best private schools and gave him every massive, unfair advantage in the entire world today. And in absolute total return, he legally declared me severely mentally incompetent and violently threw his own completely innocent, loving mother into a freezing concrete basement. He stood silently by while his incredibly evil wife violently tortured the very woman who gave him his absolute complete life. I told the judge I had already legally, completely, permanently disowned him and taken absolute, full, permanent custody of his incredibly beautiful, young, innocent children. I firmly asked the federal judge to completely lock Kendrick away for exactly 20 long, agonizing years so he could understand the exact, horrifying heavy weight of his incredibly terrible, absolute, pathetic cowardice today. I finished my official victim impact statement and walked calmly back to my wooden chair. I sat down and gently took Yvonne's warm, soft hand back into my own right now today. The new federal judge looked down at the massive, completely thick stack of official legal papers resting completely heavily on his high wooden desk. His face was a completely unreadable mask of absolute, pure, cold federal justice today. He spoke with a highly, incredibly commanding voice that violently echoed across the massive, crowded courtroom. He told Chloe that her incredibly horrific, terrifying actions were completely, absolutely the most severely evil, deeply depraved, incredibly selfish crimes he had ever completely, entirely witnessed in his 3 long decades on the federal bench today. He stated that her massive, corrupt wealth could not buy her a single tiny ounce of unearned mercy today. He officially, formally, permanently sentenced Chloe to exactly 45 incredibly long, hard years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the tiny possibility of early parole ever. Then he looked entirely directly at Kendrick and formally sentenced him to exactly 20 long, agonizing years in federal prison. The judge also loudly announced that Chloe's powerful, corrupt father, Judge Thomas Sterling, had just been indicted by a massive federal grand jury. The judge legally completely ordered the absolute, immediate, permanent federal seizure of their entire $80 million real estate empire to forcefully pay massive financial restitution back to me and my completely beautiful wife, Yvonne, today. The absolute, complete, terrifying reality of the massive, severe 45-year federal prison sentence finally violently crashed down entirely, completely onto Chloe's entirely broken, arrogant mind right now today. She completely, absolutely, entirely lost all of her remaining fake, elegant high society composure today. She began violently, completely thrashing her body and screaming incredibly loudly as two large, heavy-armed federal marshals grabbed her tight arms. She completely, desperately kicked her expensive shoes off, screaming horrific obscenities and crying incredibly massive, pathetic tears of pure, terrifying defeat today. She finally realized that her incredibly massive stolen money and her extreme white privilege could not save her from the cold, crushing weight of the absolute, completely undeniable truth today, completely. The incredibly massive, heavy wooden doors of the courtroom violently swung open as they aggressively dragged her completely, entirely screaming incredibly loudly down the long marble hallway toward her permanent dark concrete prison cell forever today. Kendrick was quietly led away in heavy, thick, steel-cold chains, weeping like a pathetic, completely broken, defeated ghost today. The federal trial of the decade was finally, entirely, completely over right now today. I slowly stood up from my wooden chair and gently helped my completely beautiful, brave wife, Yvonne, to her feet today. We did not say a word to the shocked, crowded room today. I held her soft, warm hand tightly in my own right now today. We slowly, completely, calmly, confidently walked completely together, entirely straight down the center aisle of the completely silent, massive federal courtroom today. We pushed open the incredibly heavy, thick wooden double doors and completely, absolutely, entirely stepped out into the incredibly bright, warm, beautiful morning sunlight today. Hundreds of incredibly bright, flashing news cameras completely surrounded us entirely, immediately, completely, violently snapping thousands of pictures right now, today. But I did not completely, absolutely flinch or completely look away from the incredibly massive, bright, flashing lights today. I kept my posture absolutely perfectly straight and my face composed today. I walked proudly forward into our completely restored, incredible life today, right now. 6 months have passed since the heavy doors of the federal courthouse slammed shut on the monsters who tried to destroy our lives. The transition from terrifying darkness to bright, peaceful light did not happen overnight. It took immense physical work and profound emotional healing to cleanse our massive brick estate of the toxic memories left behind by Chloe and my cowardly son, Kendrick. The very first thing I did after the highly publicized federal trial was hire a massive construction crew to demolish the subterranean prison. I stood at the top of the wooden basement stairs with my beautiful wife, Yvonne, holding her warm hand tightly as we listened to the deafening sound of heavy steel jackhammers destroying that cinder block wall. We watched the heavy gray dust clear away, revealing a large, open, empty space that would never be used for evil ever again. Over the busy next few months, we transformed that dark basement into an elegant, warm wine cellar and a massive, luxurious home theater. Where there was once a thin, dirty freezing mattress, there are now comfortable, plush, leather reclining chairs. Where my beautiful wife once shivered in terrifying darkness, there is now a massive, bright cinema screen where we sit together and watch our favorite classic movies every single Friday night. We deliberately replaced the worst, horrific trauma of our entire lives with beautiful, warm, joyous, new family traditions. It was the ultimate, profound victory over their vicious, selfish evil. Our massive brick estate is no longer a dark fortress guarding dirty secrets. It is a home filled with bright, warm light and loud, beautiful, joyous laughter right now today. That beautiful, bright laughter comes directly from our two wonderful young grandchildren. When Kendrick and Chloe were permanently locked away in maximum security federal prison, Yvonne and I officially assumed full legal custody of the innocent young children. They arrived at our restored estate looking confused and deeply quietly terrified, because they had spent their entire short lives being raised by a cold, vicious, narcissistic mother and an absent father. They were used to strict, superficial rules and a loveless, quiet, cold environment. It took incredible patience and deep, unconditional love to break down their highly defensive emotional walls. But Yvonne has the most gentle, healing, maternal touch in the entire world. We threw away all the expensive, superficial designer clothes Chloe had bought for them. We bought them comfortable, simple play clothes and let them run wild and free across the massive green manicured lawns of our beautiful estate. We taught them how to plant bright, colorful flowers in the rich, dark garden soil, getting their small hands dirty and happy. We are actively breaking the toxic generational cycle of extreme greed today. We teach them that massive wealth is not a cruel weapon used to dominate and control other vulnerable people. We teach them that true strength comes directly from profound, deep kindness and genuine, absolute mutual respect. We are raising them to be strong, proud, honorable people who will never trade their fundamental human soul for a piece of cold, hard, stolen luxury today. Our profound healing process was not confined to the heavy brick walls of our massive personal estate. The Federal Bureau completely returned all the incredibly valuable historic property deeds that Chloe and her highly corrupt father had illegally stolen from our secure trust fund. When we finally got our entire historic neighborhood legally securely back, I did not just simply return to acting as a regular, quiet landlord. I recognized that our beautiful, vibrant, predominantly black community had been incredibly close to absolute, total, terrifying financial destruction. The highly aggressive foreign investment firm had planned to violently bulldoze every single historic building and permanently displace hundreds of innocent, hardworking local families today. I entirely refused to ever let that terrifying, horrific possibility ever threaten my beautiful, vibrant community ever again. I took a massive, substantial portion of the heavily recovered stolen financial funds and directly aggressively invested the money into completely local, beautiful, black-owned small businesses. We helped an incredibly talented young local chef open a beautiful new restaurant on the exact same corner where my old destroyed hardware store used to stand many tough years ago. We funded incredibly important vital community youth centers and established massive, powerful academic scholarships for the hardworking local neighborhood children. The historic streets that were once severely threatened by the cold, massive, greedy, destructive gentrification blossomed into vibrant, highly successful, incredibly safe, beautiful avenues today. The community thrives because we fought a massive federal legal war to protect their homes and their livelihoods. People in our neighborhood smile and wave warmly when Yvonne and I slowly walk down the brightly restored historic streets. They know that we stood up to the wealthy elite and completely dismantled a corrupt syndicate that tried to erase our entire legacy. We used our reclaimed wealth to build an incredibly strong financial wall around our neighborhood so that no corrupt judge or greedy developer could ever threaten our people again. The local economy is booming and the streets are filled with the sounds of happy children and successful local merchants. It is a beautiful living testament to the sheer power of resilience and the undeniable strength of a united community. We turned a massive, horrific tragedy into a beautiful opportunity to empower the people around us. Now, when the long, busy day finally comes to a gentle close, Yvonne and I sit together on the wide wooden front porch of our beautiful brick estate. We sit in comfortable wooden rocking chairs, slowly moving back and forth as the warm evening breeze gently blows through the tall green oak trees I planted so many decades ago. The bright orange and deep purple colors of the beautiful sunset slowly paint the vast evening sky right above our quiet, peaceful neighborhood. I look over at my incredibly beautiful, brave wife. Her silver hair gently catches the fading warm sunlight, and her peaceful smile completely fills my entire tired soul with absolute, pure, profound joy. The horrific, terrifying nightmare of the dark, freezing basement feels like it happened a million long lifetimes ago. We survived the absolute worst, incredibly violent betrayal a family could ever experience. We survived and we won the total war. We hold hands quietly, listening to the sweet, beautiful sound of our two young grandchildren happily playing an innocent game of tag in the soft green grass near the blooming garden. We finally have exactly what we worked our entire lives to build. We have a safe, beautiful, warm, loving home filled with genuine respect and profound, deep, undeniable truth. We have our absolute freedom, our dignity, and our massive legacy securely intact. As the sun finally dips below the distant horizon, casting deep, quiet, peaceful shadows across the massive manicured lawn, I close my tired old eyes and deeply breathe in the sweet, fresh evening air. I know absolutely entirely that the terrifying dark is finally totally gone forever, and the beautiful morning will absolutely always return to us. I spent 8 years believing a lie crafted by the people I trusted most. But I learned that evil thrives when good men accept the dark. My daughter-in-law weaponized my age, my grief, and my own son to steal our legacy. She thought my silence meant weakness. She was wrong. Silence is the space where strategy is born. True power is not in screaming, it is in assembling the truth so flawlessly that the wicked build their own cages. Protect your blood, but never let blood blind you to betrayal. Age does not erode strength, it sharpens the blade of justice. If you found value in this story of survival and ultimate justice, please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to hear more powerful life stories just like this one. Your support helps bring these important lessons to light, so thank you for being part of our community.